Close to the edge. It had been a long time in the making. Now it was almost completed, and the slaves hacked away at the last clay remnants of the mantle. The arch-astronomer of Krul motioned lightly with his hand, and his bearers set the throne down in the shadow of the hull. Like a fish, he thought. Great flying fish. And of what seas? That could swim through the seas of space that lie between the worlds. "Are the Chelonauts ready?" the arch-astronomer asked. The master launch controller bustled forward. "Indeed, Your Prominence," he said. "How long to the doorway?" "The launch window," corrected the master launch controller carefully. 3 days, Your Prominence. Great Atuin's tail will be in an unmatched position." "Then all that remains," concluded the arch-astronomer, "is to find the appropriate sacrifices." "If only you could navigate! If only you could steer!" A wave washed over the deck. Rincewind and Two-Flower looked at each other. "I don't see how it's my fault," Two-Flower said. "You were supposed to be on watch," snapped Rincewind. "I saved us from the slavers, remember?" said Two-Flower. "I'd rather be a slave than a corpse," replied the wizard. He looked out to sea. There was definitely less horizon than there ought to be.
Brought to you by Penguin.
The colour of magic. See, great Atuin the turtle comes, swimming slowly through the interstellar gulf, hydrogen frost on his ponderous limbs, his huge and ancient shell pocked with meteor craters. Through sea-sized eyes that are crusted with rheum and asteroid dust, he stares fixedly at the destination. In a brain bigger than a city, with geological slowness, he thinks only of the weight. Most of the weight is, of course, accounted for by Beryllia, Tubal, Great Typhon, and Jerakeen, the 4 giant elephants upon whose broad and star-tanned shoulders the disk of the world rests. The Great Turtle was a mere hypothesis until the day the small and secretive kingdom of Krul, whose rimmost mountains project out over the rimfall, built a gantry and pulley arrangement at the tip of the most precipitous crag and lowered several observers over the edge in a quartz-windowed brass vessel to peer through the mist veils. The early astrozoologists, hauled back from their long dangle by teams of slaves, were able to bring back much information about the shape and nature of Atuin and the elephants. But this didn't resolve fundamental questions about the nature and purpose of the universe. For example, what was Atuin's actual sex? This vital question, said the astrozoologists, wouldn't be answered until a larger and more powerful gantry was constructed for a deep space vessel. In the meantime, they could only speculate about the revealed cosmos. There was, for example, the theory that Atuin had come from nowhere and would continue at a steady gait into nowhere for all time. An alternative was that Atuin was crawling from the birthplace to the time of mating, as were all the stars in the sky, which were, obviously, also carried by giant turtles. When they arrived, they would briefly and passionately mate for the first and only time, and from that fiery union, new turtles would be born to carry a new pattern of worlds. This was known as the Big Bang hypothesis. Thus it was that a young cosmocolonian of the Steady Gate faction, testing a new telescope with which he hoped to make measurements of the precise albedo of Great Atuin's right eye, was on this eventful evening the first outsider to see the smoke rise upward from the burning of the oldest city in the world. Fire roared through the bifurcated city of Ankh-Morpork. By now, the whole of downtown Morpork was alight, and the richer and worthier citizens of Ankh, on the far bank, were bravely responding to the situation by feverishly demolishing the bridges. But already sparks were riding the breeze and touching down far across the river. The smoke from the merry burning rose miles high in a wind-sculpted black column that could be seen across the whole of the Discworld. It was certainly impressive from the cool, dark hilltop a few leagues away, where two figures were watching. The taller of the pair was chewing on a chicken leg and leaning on a sword that was only marginally shorter than the average man. His partner was much shorter and wrapped from head to toe in a brown cloak. Later, when he has occasion to move, it'll be seen that he moves lightly, cat-like. The big man stirred.
Weasel,
Yes?
I wonder who started it.
The small man said nothing. He was watching the road in the ruddy light. He'd made out the shapes of two mounted men and some sort of low beast behind them. Doubtless a rich merchant escaping with as much treasure as he could lay frantic hands on. The weasel said as much to his companion, who shifted his grip on his sword, and as the leading rider drew near, stepped out onto the road with his face set in a grin nicely calculated to reassure, yet threaten.
Your pardon, sir.
He began. The rider reined in his horse and drew back his hood. The big man looked into a face blotched with superficial burns and punctuated by tufts of singed beard. Bugger off, said the face. You're Bravd the Hublander, aren't you? Bravd became aware that he'd fumbled the initiative. That goes for your shadow-loving fleabag partner too, wherever he's hiding. The weasel stepped up to the horse and peered at the dishevelled figure. Why, it's Rincewind the Wizard, isn't it? I thought I recognised the voice. Bravd spat and sheathed his sword. Wizards rarely had any treasure worth speaking of. The weasel pointed toward the burning city. You've been through that. The wizard rubbed a red raw hand across his eye. See him? Back there? He pointed back down the road to where his travelling companion was still approaching, having adopted a method of riding that involved falling out of the saddle every few seconds. Well, said Weasel. He started it. Bravd and Weasel looked at the figure, now hopping across the road with one foot in a stirrup.
Fire Razor, is he?
Said Bravd at last. Nah, said Rincewind. Not precisely. Got any food? There's some chicken, said Weasel, in exchange for a story.
What's his name?
Said Bravd. Two Flower, said Rincewind, dismounting. There was a scream from the roadway, cut off abruptly. One of the things he can't do, he can't ride a horse, Rincewind said. Then he dashed into the gloom. When he returned, the being called Two Flower was hanging limply over his shoulder. It was small and skinny, and dressed in a pair of knee-length breeches and a shirt in such a violent and vivid conflict of colours that Weasel's fastidious eye was offended even in the half-light. Bravd winked at the weasel and went to investigate the shape that they assumed was a pack animal. You'd be wise to forget it, said the wizard without looking up from his examination of the unconscious Two Flower. Believe me, a power protects it. A spell? Said Weasel, squatting down. No, but magic of a kind, I think. Not the usual sort. Stronger than you, Bravd. It is, I think, more cunning even than you, Weasel. Bravd looked at the shape on the road. It was closer now, and clearer in the pre-dawn light. It looked for all the world like a
box on legs?
He said. I'll tell you about it, said Rincewind. If there's any wine, that is. Several days before these events, a ship came up the Ank on the dawn tide and fetched up in the maze of wharves and docks on the Moorpork shore. It carried a cargo of pink pearls, milk nuts, pumice, and a man. It was the man who engaged the attention of Blind Hugh, one of the beggars on early duty at Pearl Dock. He nudged Cripple Wah in the ribs and pointed. The stranger was standing on the quayside, watching several straining seamen carrying a large brass-bound chest down the gangplank. When the chest had been deposited on the cobbles, the stranger reached into a pouch and there was the flash of a coin. Several coins. Gold. Blind Hugh, his body twanging like a hazel rod in the presence of water, whistled to himself. Then he nudged Wah again and sent him scurrying off down a nearby alley. Blind Hugh snatched up his begging cup and made his way across the street with an ingratiating leer. "Good day to thee, sire," he began, and found himself looking up into a face with 4 eyes in it. He froze. The stranger quickly thumbed through a small black book he'd taken from his belt. Then he said, hello. "Hello yourself," Hugh riposted. The stranger smiled widely and fumbled yet again in the pouch. This time his hand came out holding a large gold coin. It was, in fact, slightly larger than the $8,000 Ankian crown, and the design on it was unfamiliar, but it spoke inside Hugh's mind in a language he understood perfectly. The stranger consulted the small book again. "I wish to be directed to an hotel, a tavern, lodging house, inn, hospice, caravanserai." "What, all of them?" said Hugh. "Look, I know a good tavern. Is that enough?" He shuddered to think of the gold coin escaping from his life, and the big chest that comprised most of the newcomer's luggage looked to be full of gold, Hugh decided. The 4-eyed man looked at his book. "I wish to be directed to an hotel, tavern, lodge—" "Come on, then," said Hugh, and set off. When he glanced back, the little man was ambling along in the middle of the street, looking around him with an expression of keen interest. Something else Hugh saw nearly made him gibber. The massive wooden chest was following on its master's heels with a gentle rocking gait. Hugh bent slightly so that he could see under the chest. There were lots and lots of little legs. "Odd," said Eymour. "He had this big wooden chest," added Cripple Wah. "He'd have to be a merchant or a spy," said Eymour. "What do you think, Withel?" Opposite Eymour, the second greatest thief in Ankh-Morpork half closed his one eye and shrugged. There was a flutter of wings at the window. Eymour shifted his bulk out of the chair and crossed the room, coming back with a large raven. After he'd unfastened the message capsule from its leg, it flew up to join its fellows lurking among the rafters. "B12, said Eymour, tossing the little file aside and unrolling the tiny scroll within. "He says Hugh has taken our stranger to the Broken Drum." There were few people in the Broken Drum to watch Blind Hugh and Two Flower descend the stairs. When the luggage appeared behind them and started to lurch confidently down the steps, the customers at the rough wooden tables, as one man, looked suspiciously at their drinks. Broadman was browbeating the small troll who swept the bar when the trio walked past him. "What in hell's that?" he said. "Just don't talk about it," hissed Hugh. Two Flower was already thumbing through his book. I wish for an accommodation, a room, lodgings, the lodging house, full board. Are your rooms clean? A room with a view? What is your rate for one night?" Broadman looked at Hugh. The beggar shrugged. "He's got plenty of money," he said. "Tell him it's 3 copper pieces then, and that thing will have to go in the stable." Broadman held up 3 thick red fingers, and the man's face was suddenly a sunny display of comprehension. He reached into his pouch and laid 3 large gold pieces in Broadman's palm. Broadman stared at them. They represented about 4 times the worth of the Broken Drum, staff included. He swallowed. All eyes in the room were watching the stranger, except for a pair belonging to Rincewind the Wizard, who was sitting in the darkest corner nursing a mug of very small beer. He was watching the luggage. Watch Rincewind. Look at him. Scrawny, like most wizards, and clad in a dark red robe on which a few mystic sigils were embroidered in tarnished sequins. Around his neck was a chain bearing the bronze octagon that marked him as an alumnus of Unseen University, the High School of Magic. Graduates were usually destined for mageship at least, but Rincewind, after an unfortunate event, had left knowing only one spell and made a living of sorts around the town by capitalising on an innate gift for languages. He put his acquaintances in mind of a bright rodent, and he knew sapient pearwood when he saw it. He was seeing it now and didn't quite believe it. An archmage, by dint of great effort and much expenditure, might eventually obtain a small staff made from the timber of the sapient pear tree. It grew only on the sites of ancient magic. There were probably no more than 2 such staffs in all the cities of the Circle C. A large chest of it. Rincewind tried to work it out, and decided that even if the box were crammed with star opals and sticks of auriculatum, the contents wouldn't be worth 1/10 the price of the container. He stood up and made his way to the trio. "May I be of assistance?" "Shove off, Rincewind," snarled Broadman. "I only thought it might be useful to address this gentleman in his own tongue," said the wizard gently. He smiled politely at the stranger and tried a few words of Shimmeran, but the stranger only looked bemused. Rincewind switched to High Borgravian, to Vanglishmet, Sumtree, and even Blackarugu. Each was met with polite incomprehension. In desperation, he tried Heathen Trob, and the little man's face split into a delighted grin. "At last," he said. "My good sir, this is remarkable." Although in Trob, the last word in fact became "a thing which may happen but once in the usable lifetime of a canoe, hollowed diligently by axe and fire from the tallest diamond-wood tree that grows in the forests on the slopes of Mount Awayawa, home of the fire gods, or so it is said." Rincewind swallowed. "Broadman," he said, "2 mugs of your best ale, please." "You can understand him?" "Oh, sure." Tell him he's very welcome. Tell him breakfast is, 1 gold piece." "Stranger," said Rincewind levelly in Trob, "if you stay here, you will be knifed or poisoned by nightfall. But don't stop smiling, or so will I." "Oh, come now," said the stranger, looking around. "This looks like a delightful place, a genuine Morporkian tavern. I've heard so much about them, you know. All these quaint old beams, and so reasonable, too." Rincewind glanced around quickly, in case some leakage of enchantment from the magician's quarter across the river had momentarily transported them to some other place. Nah, this was still the interior of the Drum, its walls stained with smoke, its floor a compost of old rushes and nameless beetles, its sour beer not so much purchased as hired for a while. The visitor went on, "My name is Twoflower," and extended his hand. "Pleased to meet you," said Rincewind. "I'm Rincewind. Look, I wasn't joking. This is a tough place." "Good! Exactly what I wanted." "Hey? What is this stuff in the mugs?" "This? Beer. Thanks, Broadman. Yeah, beer, you know." "Beer? Ah, the so typical drink. A small gold piece will be sufficient payment, do you think? I don't want to cause offence." Croaked Rincewind. "I mean, no, it won't cause offence." "Good. You say this is a tough place. Frequented, you mean, by heroes and men of adventure?" Rincewind considered this. "Yes." "Excellent! I would like to meet some." "You've come to hire mercenaries?" "Oh, no, I just want to meet them, so that when I get home I can say that I did it." Rincewind thought that a meeting with most of the Drum's clientele would mean that Twoflower never went home again, unless he lived downriver and happened to float past. "Where is your home?" he inquired. "Have you heard of the city of Bezpelagic?" "Well, I didn't spend much time in Trob. I was just passing through, you know." "Oh, it's not in Trob. I speak Trob because there are many Betrobi sailors in our ports. Bezpelagic is the major seaport of the Agatian Empire. You sail turnwise from the Brown Islands for about a week, and there it is. Are you all right? Rincewind had choked on his beer. The stranger came from the counterweight continent, small but equal in weight to all the mighty land masses in its hemicircle. Why so? Because it's largely made of gold. Rincewind pinched himself and listened open-mouthed as Two-Flower talked. "So, I decided to see for myself," the little man was saying. 8 years saving up this has cost me, but worth every half rhino. I mean, here I am, in Ankh-Morpork, famed in song and story, I mean, in the streets that have known the tread of Herrick Whiteblade, Harun the Barbarian, Bravd the Hublander, and the Weasel. It's just like I imagined, you know. Rincewind's face was a mask of fascinated horror. "I just couldn't stand it anymore back in Bezpelagic," Two-Flower went on blithely. "Sitting at a desk all day, just adding up columns of figures. Where's the romance in that? Two-Flower, I thought, it's now or never. So, I bought a passage on the next ship to the Brown Islands." "No guards?" murmured Rincewind. "No? Why?" "You have, gold." "Barely 2,000 rhino. Hardly enough to keep a man alive for more than a month or two. At home, that is. I imagine they might stretch a bit further here." "Would a rhino be one of those big gold coins?" said Rincewind. "Yes." "Will 2,000 be sufficient, do you think?" croaked Rincewind. "I mean, yes, sufficient." An idea occurs to me. Rincewind, would you perhaps consent to be employed as a, I don't know, perhaps the word guide would fit the circumstances? I think I could afford to pay you a rhino a day. A rhino, you say? One a day? Every day? Well, I think perhaps in the circumstances I should make it 1.5 rhino per day, plus any out-of-pocket expenses, of course. The wizard rallied magnificently. "That will be fine," he said. Two-Flower reached into his pouch and took out a large round gold object, glanced at it for a moment and slipped it back. Rincewind didn't get a chance to see it properly. "I think," said the tourist, "that I'd like a little rest now. It was a long crossing. And then perhaps you would care to call back at noon and we can take a look at the city." "Sure." "Then please be good enough to ask the innkeeper to show me to my room." Broadman led the way up the wooden steps behind the bar. After a few seconds, the luggage got up and pattered across the floor after them. Then the wizard looked down at the 6 big coins in his hand. Two-Flower had insisted on paying his first 4 days' wages in advance. Blind Hugh nodded and smiled encouragingly. Rincewind snarled at him. When Rincewind returned to the Broken Drum, he was just in time to collide with a man who came out backwards fast. The stranger's haste was in part accounted for by the spear in his chest. Rincewind peered around the doorframe. The dark interior of the drum was a broil of fighting men, quite a number of them in bits. Rincewind reached the stairway. He made the stairs in one breathless rush. In the corridor above, he saw the floor in front of him was scattered with bodies. A big black-bearded man with a bloody sword in one hand was trying a door handle. "Hey!" screamed Rincewind. The man looked around. Rincewind drew himself up into a wizardly pose. His hand was flung back. "Asonaitai Kairusha Beelzebub." The man hesitated as he waited for the magic. The conclusion that there wasn't going to be any hit him at the same time as Rincewind, whirring wildly down the passage, kicked him sharply in the groin. As he screamed and clutched at himself, the wizard dragged open the door, sprang inside, slammed it behind him and threw his body against it, panting. There was Two-Flower, sleeping peacefully on the low bed, and there at the foot of the bed was the luggage. Rincewind took a few steps forward. The chest was open. There were bags inside, and in one of them he caught the gleam of gold. For a moment, greed overcame caution, and he reached out gingerly, and was surprised to see a slight tremor in the chest's open lid. "Rincewind!" Two-Flower sprang off the bed. "My dear chap, right on time. We'll just have lunch, and then I'm sure you've got a wonderful programme lined up for this afternoon." Rincewind took a deep breath. "Let's eat somewhere else. There's been a bit of a fight down below." "A tavern brawl? Why didn't you wake me up?" "Well, you see, What?" Rincewind sat down heavily on the bed. "You want to see a fight?" "Yes, what's wrong with that? For a start, people get hurt." "Oh, I wasn't suggesting we get involved. I just want to see one, that's all. And some of your famous heroes." There was a clatter of running feet in the street outside and a fresh uproar from downstairs. It was followed by a commotion on the stairs. The door was flung open before Rincewind could make a dash for the window. But instead of the greed-crazed villain he expected, he found himself looking into the round, red face of a sergeant of the watch. The watch was always careful not to intervene too soon in any brawl where the odds weren't heavily stacked in their favour. The job carried a pension and attracted a cautious, thoughtful kind of man. "Everything all right here, then?" the sergeant said. "Oh, fine," said Rincewind. "Got held up, did you?" The sergeant ignored him. "This is the foreigner, then?" he inquired. "We were just leaving," said Rincewind quickly. He marched out into the corridor. Two-Flower followed, and a few seconds later there was a strangling sound from the sergeant as the luggage closed its lid with a snap, stood up, stretched, and marched after them. Watchmen were dragging bodies out of the room downstairs. "Who are all these men?" said Two-Flower. "Oh, you know," said Rincewind. And before he could stop himself, some part of his brain that had nothing to do took control of his mouth and added, "Heroes, in fact." "Really?" Two-Flower had thrown back the lid of the luggage and was hastily pulling out a heavy black cube. "This is fantastic," he said. "What's he going on about?" said the sergeant doubtfully. "He's pleased you rescued us," said Rincewind. "I expect you know what this is, don't you?" Two-Flower asked. Rincewind stared down at the box. It had a round glass eye protruding from the centre of one face and a lever at the back. Not wholly. "It's a device for making pictures quickly. Quite a new invention. I'm rather proud of it. But look, these gentlemen might be sort of apprehensive. Could you explain it to them? I'll reimburse them for their time, of course." "He's got a box with a demon in it that draws pictures," said Rincewind shortly. "Do what the madman says, and he'll give you gold." The watch smiled nervously. "I'd like you in the picture, Rincewind. That's fine." Two-Flower took out the golden disc that Rincewind had noticed before, squinted at its unseen face for a moment, muttered, "30 seconds should about do it," and said brightly, "Smile, please." Rincewind looked at the tiny square of glass in astonishment. There he was, all right, a tiny figure in perfect colour, standing in front of a group of watchmen whose faces were each frozen in a terrified rictus. A buzz of wordless terror went up from the men around him as they craned over his shoulder to look. Grinning, Two-Flower produced a handful of the smaller coins Rincewind now recognised as quarter rhino. He winked at the wizard. "I had similar problems when I stopped over in the Brown Islands," he said. "They thought the iconograph steals a bit of their souls." Laughable, isn't it? They lunched at a small eating house near the Brass Bridge, with the luggage nestling under the table. Two-Flower said, "Tavern fights are pretty common around here, I expect." "Oh, fairly." "No doubt fixtures and fittings get damaged?" "You mean like benches and whatnot?" "Yeah, I suppose so." "That must be upsetting for the innkeepers. One of the risks of the job." Two-Flower regarded him thoughtfully. "I might be able to help there," he said. "Risks are my business." "I don't believe it." "Oh, I don't take risks. I assess risks day after day." "What for?" "In my language, we call it—" He said a collection of outlandish syllables. "In sewer ants," repeated Rincewind. It's a funny word. What's it mean? Well, suppose you have a ship loaded with, say, gold bars. It might run into storms or be taken by pirates. You don't want that to happen, so you take out an in-sewer ants policy. I work out the odds against the cargo being lost, based on weather reports and piracy records for the last 20 years. Then I add a bit. Then you pay me some money based on those odds. And then, if the cargo is lost, I reimburse you. Reimburse? Pay you the value of your cargo, said Two Flower patiently. I get it. It's like a bet, right? A wager? Well, in a way, I suppose. And you make money at this in-sewer ants. It offers a return on investment, certainly. In the long afternoon, they toured the city. Rincewind took every opportunity to operate the box. Two Flower was only too pleased to allow this, since that enabled the little man to appear in his own pictures. It was while he was thus engaged in the Plaza of Broken Moons that disaster struck. Two Flower had posed alongside a bewildered charm seller. Rincewind got down on one knee, the better to arrange the picture, and pressed the enchanted lever. The box said, "It's no good. I've run out of pink." A hitherto unnoticed door opened in front of his eyes. A small, green and hideously warty humanoid figure leant out, pointed at a colour-encrusted palette in one clawed hand, and screamed at him. "No pink, see? It's monochrome from now on, friend, all right?" All right, yeah, sure," said Rincewind. In one dim corner of the little box, he thought he could see an easel and a tiny unmade bed. "So long as that's understood," said the imp, and shut the door. "Two Flower," Rincewind began, and looked up. Two Flower had vanished. As Rincewind stared at the crowd, there came a gentle prod in the small of his back. "Turn without haste," said a voice like black silk, "or kiss your kidneys goodbye." Rincewind turned slowly, feeling the point of the sword scrape along his ribs. At the other end of the blade, he recognised Stren Withel, thief, cruel swordsman, disgruntled contender for the title of worst man in the world, Emor's sidekick. "Hi," Rincewind said weakly. A few yards away, he noticed a couple of unsympathetic men raising the lid of the luggage and pointing excitedly at the bags of gold. Withel smiled. "I know you," he said. "A gutter wizard. What is that thing?" Rincewind became aware that the lid of the luggage was trembling slightly, although there was no wind, and he was still holding the picture box. "This? Oh, it makes pictures. Hey, just hold that smile, will you?" He backed away quickly and pointed the box. For a moment, Withel hesitated. "What?" he said. "That's fine. Hold it just like that," said Rincewind. From the luggage, there was a snap and a duet of horrible screams. By the time Withel looked for Rincewind again, he was on the other side of the plaza and still accelerating. Behind him galloped the luggage. Emor's headquarters were in the leaning tower at the junction of Rhyme Street and Frost Alley. At midnight, the solitary guard leaning in the shadows looked up at the conjoining planets and wondered idly what change in his fortune they might herald. There was the faintest of sounds, as of a gnat yawning. The guard glanced down and caught the glimmer of moonlight on something lying in the mud a few yards away. He picked it up. The lunar light gleamed on gold. There was a slight sound again, and another coin rolled into the gutter on the other side of the street. By the time he'd picked it up, there was another one, a little way off and still spinning. As he drew level with the opposite alley mouth, some more fell. It was still in its bag. There was an awful lot of it, and Rincewind brought it down heavily onto his head. When the guard came to, he found himself looking up into the wild-eyed face of a wizard who was menacing his throat with a sword. In the darkness, Something was gripping his leg. "Where is he, the rich foreigner?" hissed the wizard. "Quickly!" "I've got him at Broadman's place." With only his homemade phrasebook to help him, Two-Flower was trying to explain the mysteries of inn-sewer ants to Broadman. The fat innkeeper was listening intently, his little black eyes glittering. From the other end of the table, Emor watched. Beside him, Stren Withel paced up and down. It was strange, but the little man didn't seem to realise the seriousness of his position. He'd been talking for ages to Broadman, and Emor had seen a piece of paper change hands, and Broadman had given the foreigner some coins. It was strange. When Broadman got up and waddled past Emor's chair, the thief-master's arm shot out like a steel spring and grabbed the fat man by his apron. "What was all that about, friend?" Nothing, Emor, just private business like." "There are no secrets between friends, Broadman." "Yeah, well, I'm not sure about it myself, really. It's sort of a bet, see?" said the innkeeper nervously. "In-sewer ants, it's called. It's like a bet that the broken drum won't get burnt down." Emor laughed. "The man must be mad." "He says now he's got the, can't remember the word, begins with a P. It's what you might call the stake money. The people he works for in the Agatian Empire will pay up if the broken drum burns down. Not that I hope it does burn down, the broken drum, I mean. It's like home to me, is the drum." The door slammed back on its hinges and thudded into the wall. "Hey, that's my door!" screamed Broadman. Then he ducked behind the table, a mere shaving of time before a short black dart sped across the room and thunked into the woodwork. Emor moved his hand carefully and poured out another flagon of beer. "Won't you join me, Zlorf?" he said levelly. "And put that sword away, Stren. Zlorf Flannelfoot is our friend." The president of the Assassins' Guild spun his short blowgun dexterously and slotted it into its holster in one smooth movement. He strolled down the stairs, followed by a number of assassins. When he was directly in front of Emor, he said, "I've come for the tourist. Is he that funny-looking one over there?" "Yes." Zlorf stared at Two-Flower, who grinned at him. "Who is your client, may I ask?" said Emor. Zlorf held up a hand. "Please," he protested. "Professional etiquette." "Of course. By the way—" The door flew open, badly damaging the assassin who was standing beside it. "Stop doing that!" shrieked Broadman from under his table. Zlorf and Emor stared up at the figure on the threshold. It was short, fat, and richly dressed. There were a number of tall, big shapes looming behind it. "Who's that?" said Zlorf. "I know him," said Emor. "His name's Rurpf. He runs the Groaning Platter Tavern down by Brass Bridge. Stren, remove him." Several very large trolls ducked under the doorway and stood on either side of the fat man, blinking in the light. Muscles the size of melons bulged in forearms like flour sacks. Each troll held a double-headed axe between thumb and forefinger. "What do you want?" said Emor. "I'm here on behalf of the Guild of Merchants and Traders," said Rurpf evenly. "To protect our interests, you might say. Meaning the little man. I'm vice-guildmaster in charge of tourism, you know." Emor wrinkled his brow. "Tourism?" "Stands to reason," said Rurpf. "People robbing and murdering all over the place. What sort of impression are visitors going to take away? You come to see our fine city and you wake up dead in some back alley? How are you going to tell all your friends what a great time you're having? Let's face it, you've got to move with the times." Zlorf and Emor met each other's gaze. "We have we?" said Emor. "Then let us move, brother," agreed Zlorf. In one movement, he brought his blowgun to his mouth and sent a dart hissing towards the nearest troll. That was the start. Wizards, Even failed wizards have, in addition to rods and cones in their eyeballs, the tiny octagons that enable them to see into the far octarine, the basic colour of which all other colours are merely pale shadows impinging on normal four-dimensional space. And those who are sensitive to radiations in the far octarine, the eighth colour, the pigment of the imagination, can see things others can't. Thus it was that Rincewind, hurrying through the bazaars of Moorpork with the luggage trundling behind him, jostled a tall, dark figure, turned to deliver a few suitable curses, and beheld death. It had to be death. No one else went around with empty eye sockets. And, of course, the scythe over one shoulder was another clue. "Rincewind," Death said, in tones as deep and heavy as the slamming of leaden doors far underground. Said Rincewind. "Why are you here?" Why not?" said Rincewind. "I have an appointment with thee this very night." "Oh, no, not—" "I was expecting to meet thee in Cephalopolis." "But that's 500 miles away." "I could lend you a very fast horse." "No!" "It won't hurt a bit." "No!" Rincewind turned and ran. Death watched him go and shrugged. Short Street, Moorpork, is in fact one of the longest in the city. The broken drum is so placed that it looks down the full length of the street. Inside, the war was going well. At the furthermost end of Short Street, a dark oblong rose on hundreds of tiny legs and started to run. By the time it was halfway up the street, it was moving arrow fast. A darker shadow inched its way along one of the walls of the drum, a few yards from the two trolls who were guarding the door. One of the trolls tapped his colleague on the shoulder. He pointed down the starlit street. Rincewind darted from his hiding place, turned, and hurled his burden through the drum's nearest window. The bag arced across the room, turning slowly in the air, and burst on the edge of a table. A moment later, gold coins were rolling across the floor, spinning, glittering. 70 men and a dozen trolls froze in mid-grope. Outside, there was a sudden crescendo of running feet, and for the last time, the door opened. In fact, it exploded. Door and frame landed on a table which flew into splinters. It was then that the frozen fighters noticed that there was something else in the pile of wood. It was a box, shaking itself madly to free itself of the smashed timber around it. Rincewind appeared in the ruined doorway, hurling another of his gold grenades. It smashed into a wall, showering coins. Down in the cellar, Broadman looked up, muttered to himself, and carried on with his work. His entire supply of candles had already been strewn on the floor, mixed with his store of kindling wood. Now he was attacking a barrel of lamp oil. "In sewer ants," he muttered. Oil gushed out and swirled around his feet. Withel stormed across the floor, his face a mask of rage. Rincewind took careful aim and caught the thief full in the chest with a bag of gold. Emor was shouting and pointing an accusing finger. A raven swooped down from its perch in the rafters and dived at the wizard, talons open and gleaming. At about the halfway point, the luggage leapt from its bed of splinters, gaped briefly in mid-air, and snapped shut. It landed lightly. Rincewind saw its lid open again, just far enough for a tongue, large as a palm leaf, red as mahogany, to lick up a few errant feathers. At the same time, the giant candle wheel fell from the ceiling, plunging the room into gloom. Rincewind, coiling himself like a spring, gave a standing jump and grasped a beam, swinging himself up into the relative safety of the roof with a strength that amazed him. Rincewind rolled. For a moment he thought Withel was going to spit him where he lay. But it was worse than that. He was waiting for him to get up. "I see you have a sword, wizard," he said quietly. "I suggest you rise and we shall see how well you use it. Rincewind stood up as slowly as he dared. You know that wizards can't be killed by edged weapons? Withel smiled coldly. So I've heard, he said. I look forward to putting it to the test. As his sword went back, the sullen glow that had been growing in the doorway of the broken drum flickered, dimmed, and erupted into a roaring fireball that sent the walls billowing outward and carried the roof 100 feet into the air. Withel stared at the boiling flames unnerved. Flames were racing along the rooftops on either side of the street. Rincewind grabbed Two Flower's arm and dragged him down the street. Something was puzzling Rincewind. I'm sure all the candles went out, he said. So how did the drum catch fire? I don't know, replied Two Flower. It'll be a blow for old Broadman. Still, he was wise. I've still got the rhino he paid as his first premium. Rincewind didn't know the meaning of the word premium, but his mind was working fast. You ensured the drum? You bet Broadman it wouldn't catch fire? Oh, yes, standard valuation, 200 rhino. Why do you ask? Rincewind turned and stared at the flames racing towards them, and wondered how much of Ankh-Morpork could be bought for 200 rhino. Quite a large piece, he decided. Bravd looked at the weasel and raised his eyebrows. And that's it, said Rincewind. The luggage caught up with us. Don't ask me how. Is there any more wine? The weasel picked up the empty wineskin. I think you've had just about enough wine this night, he said. He turned away and swung himself into the saddle of the horse that Bravd was holding. A few moments later, the two heroes were just specks under a cloud of dust. Rincewind stared muzzily at the recumbent tourist. A stray thought, wandering through the dimensions in search of a mind to harbour it, slid into his brain. Here's another fine mess you got me into, he moaned, and slumped backwards. The Sending of 8. The Discworld offers sights far more impressive than those found in universes built by creators with less imagination but more mechanical aptitude. Perhaps the most magnificent sight is the hub. There, a spire of green ice 10 miles high rises through the clouds and supports at its peak the realm of Dun Manifestin, the abode of the Disc Gods. On this particular day, blind Io, by dint of constant vigilance the chief of the gods, sat with his chin in his hand and looked at the gaming board on the red marble table in front of him. Blind Io had got his name because where his eye socket should have been, there was nothing but 2 areas of blank skin. His eyes, of which he had an impressively large number, led a semi-independent life of their own. Several were currently hovering above the table. The gaming board was a carefully carved map of the Discworld overprinted with squares. A number of beautifully modelled playing pieces were now occupying some of the squares. An onlooker would, for example, have recognised in 2 of them the likenesses of Bravd and the Weasel. Still in the game were Io, Offler, the crocodile god, Zephyrus, the god of slight breezes, Fate, and the Lady. There was an air of concentration around the board now that the lesser players had been removed from the game. Blind Io took up the dice box, which was a skull whose various orifices had been stoppered with rubies, and with several of his eyes on the lady, he rolled 3 5s. She smiled. This was the nature of the lady's eyes. They were bright green, lacking iris or pupil, and they glowed from within. The room was silent. She scrabbled in her box of pieces, and from the very bottom produced a couple that she set down on the board with 2 decisive clicks. The rest of the players, as one god, craned forward to peer at them. "A renegade withered and thumb fort of Clark," said Offler, the crocodile god, hindered as usual by his tusks. "Well, really." With one claw, he pushed a pile of bone-white tokens into the centre of the table. The lady nodded slightly. She picked up the dice cup and held it as steady as a rock, yet all the gods could hear the cubes rattling about inside. And then she sent them bouncing across the table. A 6, a 3, a 5. Something was happening to the 5, however. Battered by the chance collision of several billion molecules, the die flipped onto a point, spun gently, and came down a 7. Blind Dio picked up the cube and counted the sides. "Come on," he said wearily. "Play fair." Two-Flower was a tourist, the first ever seen on the Discworld. Tourist, Rincewind had decided, meant idiot. As they rode leisurely through the time-scented bee-humming air, Rincewind pondered on the experiences of the last few days. While the little foreigner was obviously insane, he was also generous. Rincewind rather liked him. Disliking him would be like kicking a puppy. Currently, Two-Flower was showing a great interest in the theory and practice of magic. Rincewind was trying to explain that magic had once been wild and lawless, but had been tamed back in the mists of time by the olden ones. He went on to add that some of the ancient magic could still be found in its raw state, recognisable to the initiated by the eightfold shape it made in the crystalline structure of space-time. There was the metal octyron, for example, and the gas octogen. Both radiated dangerous amounts of raw enchantment. Rincewind turned in his saddle and glanced at Two-Flower's luggage, which was currently ambling along on its little legs, occasionally snapping its lid at butterflies. There was a faint sound, hardly louder than the noise of the bees in the rosemary by the road. It had a curiously bony quality, as of rolling skulls or a whirling dice box. Rincewind peered around. There was no one nearby. There came a slight breeze that grew and went in the space of a few heartbeats. It left the world unchanged, save in a few interesting particulars. There was now, for example, a 5-metre-tall mountain troll standing in the road. It was exceptionally angry. This was partly because trolls generally are, in any case, but it was exacerbated by its sudden and instantaneous teleportation from its lair in the Ramarok Mountains 3,000 miles away. So it bared its fangs and charged. Rincewind drew his sword, and with a smooth overarm throw, completely failed to hit the troll. The blade plunged on into the heather at the side of the track. There was the faintest of sounds, like the rattle of old teeth. The sword struck a boulder concealed in the heather. It sprang up like a leaping salmon, and in mid-ricochet plunged deeply into the back of the troll's grey neck. The creature grunted, and with one swipe of a claw gouged a wound in the flank of Two-Flower's horse, which screamed and bolted into the trees. The troll spun around and made a grab for Rincewind. Then its sluggish nervous system brought it the message that it was dead. "Ah," thought Rincewind as his horse reared in terror. It staggered two-legged across the road, and then, screaming, turned and galloped into the woods. "Rincewind!" The long aisles of trees threw Two-Flower's voice from side to side and eventually tossed it back to him unheeded. He sat down on a rock and tried to think. He was lost. His luggage was missing. It was also starting to rain. He squirmed uncomfortably on the damp stone and tried to look on the bright side. For example, during its mad dash, his plunging horse had burst through some bushes and disturbed a she-bear with her cubs, but had gone on before the bear could react. Then it had suddenly been galloping over the sleeping bodies of a large wolf pack, and again its mad speed had been such that the furious yelping had been left far behind. Nevertheless, the day was wearing on, and perhaps it would be a good idea, Two-Flower thought, not to hang about in the open. Perhaps there was a... He racked his brains trying to remember what sort of accommodation forests traditionally offered. Perhaps there was a gingerbread house or something. The stone really was uncomfortable. Two-Flower looked down and for the first time noticed the strange carving. It looked like a spider. Or was it a squid? Moss and lichens rather blurred the precise details, but they didn't blur the runes carved below it. They said, "Traveller, the hospitable temple of Bel Shamharoth lies 1,000 paces hubwards." Now, this was strange, Two-Flower realised, because although he could read the message, the actual letters were completely unknown to him. Somehow, the message was arriving in his brain without the tedious necessity of passing through his eyes. He stood up and untied his horse from a sapling. He wasn't sure which way the hub lay, but there seemed to be an old track of sorts leading between the trees. About 3 miles away, a failed wizard was hanging by his hands from a high branch in a beech tree. This was the end result of 5 minutes of crowded activity. First, an enraged she-bear had barged through the undergrowth and taken the throat out of his horse with one swipe of her paw. Then, as Rincewind had fled the carnage, he'd run into a glade in which a number of irate wolves were milling about. His instructors at Unseen University, who despaired of Rincewind's inability to master levitation, would have been amazed at the speed with which he reached and climbed the nearest tree without apparently touching it. Now, there was just the matter of the snake. It was large and green and wound itself along the branch with reptilian patience. Rincewind wondered if it was poisonous, then chided himself for asking such a silly question. Of course it would be poisonous. "What are you grinning for?" he asked the figure on the next branch. "I can't help it," said Death. "Now would you be so kind as to let go? I can't hang around all day." "I can," said Rincewind defiantly. The wolves, clustered around the base of the tree, looked up with interest at their next meal, talking to himself. "It won't hurt," said Death. Rincewind noticed another branch crossing his dangerously narrowing one a few feet away. If he could just reach it. He swung himself forward, one hand outstretched. The branch, already bending, didn't break. It simply made a wet little sound and twisted. Rincewind found that he was now hanging onto the end of a tongue of bark and fibre, lengthening as it peeled away from the tree. He looked down and with a sort of fatal satisfaction realised that he would land right on the biggest wolf. His elbow nudged something. It was the tree trunk. The strip had carried him right to the end of the branch, but there were no other branches. The smooth bark beside him offered no handholds. It offered hands, though. 2 were even now thrusting through the mossy bark beside him, slim hands, green as young leaves. Then a shapely arm followed, and then the Hamadryad leant right out and grasped the astonished wizard firmly and drew him into the tree. The solid bark parted like a mist, closed like a clam. Blind Io pushed his stack of chips across the table and strode out. A few demigods tittered. At least Offler had taken the loss of a perfectly good troll with precise if somewhat reptilian grace. The lady's last opponent shifted his seat until he faced her across the board. "Lord," she said politely. "Lady," he acknowledged. Their eyes met. Fate was a taciturn god. His were features that a maiden would confidently proffer a glass of small beer to, should they appear at her back door. His was a face a kindly youth would gladly help over a stile. Except for his eyes, of course. The lady laid 21 white chips on the table. Then from her robe she took another chip, silvery and translucent, and twice the size of the others. The soul of a true hero always finds a better rate of exchange, and is valued highly by the gods. Fate raised an eyebrow. "And no cheating, lady," he said. "But who could cheat fate?" she asked. He shrugged. "No one. Yet everyone tries." The lady smiled. "I believe I felt you giving me a little assistance against the others. But of course, so that the end game could be the sweeter, lady. And now..." He reached into his gaming box and brought forth a piece, setting it down on the board with a satisfied air. The watching deities gave a collective sigh. Even the lady was momentarily taken aback. It was certainly ugly. It seemed to be all suckers and tentacles, and mandibles, the lady observed, and one great eye. Fate scooped the dice into the box and then glanced up. "Unless," he said, "you wish to resign." She shook her head. "Play," she said. Rincewind knew what was inside trees. Wood, sap, possibly squirrels, not a palace. Still, the cushions underneath him were definitely softer than wood. The wine in the wooden cup beside him was much tastier than sap, and there could be absolutely no comparison between a squirrel and the girl sitting before him, clasping her knees and watching him thoughtfully, unless mention was made of certain hints of furriness. The girl was green, flesh green. Rincewind could be absolutely certain about that, because all she was wearing was a medallion around her neck. Her long hair had a faintly mossy look about it. She had said nothing. Apart from indicating the couch and offering him the wine, she'd done no more than sit watching him, occasionally rubbing a deep scratch on her arm. Rincewind hurriedly recalled that a dryad was so linked to her tree that she suffered wounds in sympathy. "Sorry about that," he said quickly. "It was just an accident. I mean, there were these wolves and—"
"You had to climb my tree, and I rescued you," said the dryad smoothly. "How lucky for you, and for your friend, perhaps."
"Friend?"
"The little man with the magic box,"
said the dryad. "Oh, sure, him," said Rincewind vaguely. "Yeah, I hope he's okay."
"He needs your help."
"Usually does. Did he make it to the tree too?"
"He made it to the temple of Bel-Shamharoth."
Rincewind choked on his wine. His ears tried to crawl into his head in terror of the syllables they had just heard. The Soul Eater. The Soul Eater. His number lieth between 7 and 9. It is twice 4, Rincewind quoted, his mind frozen with fear. Oh, no. Where's the temple?
"Upwards, towards the centre of the forest."
The dryad stood up and stretched out her hand.
"Come, I am Drueli. Come with me and watch your friend's fate."
A staircase, broad as a major highway, wound up through the tree, with vast rooms leading off at every landing. Sourceless yellow light was everywhere. "We really in a tree?" Rincewind asked.
"We are?" Drueli laughed. "I can see into your mind, false wizard. Am I not a dryad? Do you not know that what you belittle by the name tree is but the mere 4-dimensional analogue of a whole multi-dimensional universe which... No, I can see you do not. I should have realized that you weren't a real wizard."
Something made Rincewind turn around. There were 3 he-dryads behind him. They were as naked as the woman and unarmed. That last fact was irrelevant, however. They looked at him with wooden menace. Their skins were the colour of walnut husks, and under it, muscles bulged like sacks of melons. He turned around again and grinned weakly at Drueli. "I'm not rescued, am I? I'm captured, right?"
"Of course."
"And you're not letting me go?" Drueli shook her head.
"You hurt the tree. But you are lucky. Your friend is going to meet Bel-Shamharoth. You will only die."
From behind, 2 hands gripped his shoulders in much the same way that an old tree root coils relentlessly around a pebble. There was a vast empty space like a hall, its roof lost in the golden haze. The endless stair ran right through it. Several hundred dryads parted respectfully when Drueli approached, and stared through Rincewind as he was propelled firmly along behind.
"Oh, incompetent wizard," said Drueli. See some magic. Not your weasel-faced tame magic, but root and branch magic. The old magic. Wild magic. Watch.
50 or so of the females formed a tight cluster, joined hands, and walked backwards until they formed the circumference of a large circle. The rest of the dryads began a low chant. Then, at a nod from Drueli, the circle began to spin widdershins. As the pace began to quicken and the complicated threads of the chant began to rise, Rincewind felt the familiar sticky prickling in the scalp that indicated the build-up of a heavy charge of raw enchantment in the vicinity. And so he was not utterly amazed when a few seconds later a shaft of vivid octarine light speared down from the invisible ceiling and focused, crackling, in the centre of the circle. There it formed an image of a storm-swept, tree-girt hill with a temple on its crest. Rain streamed off the black walls of the temple. The only sign of life was the horse tethered outside. It wasn't Two-Flower's horse. It was a white charger with hooves the size of meat dishes and leather harness a-glitter with ostentatious gold ornamentation. It was currently enjoying a nosebag.
The sender of 8 has 2 for dinner, it seems, said Drueli.
She waved a hand. The focus of the image moved inwards, darted through a great octagonal archway, and sped along the corridor within. There was a figure there, sidling along stealthily with its back against one wall. There was no mistaking that shape. He'd seen it many times. The wide chest, the neck like a tree trunk, surprisingly small head under its wild thatch of black hair looking like a tomato on a coffin. He could put a name to the creeping figure, and that name was Harun the Barbarian. Harun was one of the Circle C's more durable heroes, a fighter of dragons, a despoiler of temples, a hired sword, the king-post of every street brawl. He could even, unlike many heroes of Rincewind's acquaintance, speak words of more than 2 syllables, given time and maybe a hint or two. There was a sound on the edge of Rincewind's hearing. It sounded like several skulls bouncing down the steps of some distant dungeon.
Who is that, false wizard?
Said Drueli, pointing at the Harun image. I am a real wizard, snarled Rincewind. He stamped a foot petulantly.
Indeed, said the dryad. Then let us see you pass a spell.
Began Rincewind. The fact was that since the ancient and mysterious spell had squatted in his mind, he'd been unable to remember even the simplest cantrap for, say, killing cockroaches or scratching the small of his back without using his hands. It was perhaps untrue to say that he'd learnt the spell. It had learnt him. The episode had led to his expulsion from Unseen University because, for a bet, he had dared to open the pages of the last remaining copy of the creator's own grimoire, the Octavo. The spell had leapt out of the page and instantly burrowed deeply into his mind, from whence even the combined talents of the Faculty of Medicine had been unable to coax it. Precisely which one it was they were also unable to ascertain, except that it was one of the 8 basic spells that were intricately interwoven with the very fabric of time and space itself. Since then, it had been showing a worrying tendency, when Rincewind was feeling run down or especially threatened, to try and get itself said.
A small one would do,
said Drueli, watching him curl his lips in a frenzy of anger and embarrassment. The spell chose that moment to vault into the temporarily abandoned saddle of Rincewind's consciousness. I do know a spell, he said wearily.
Yes, pray tell,
said Drueli. Rincewind wasn't sure that he dared, although the spell was trying to take control of his tongue. You said you could read my mind, he said. Read it! She stepped forward, looking mockingly into his eyes. Her smile froze. Her hands raised protectively, she crouched back. From her throat came a sound of pure terror. Rincewind looked around. The rest of the dryads were also backing away. What had he done? Something terrible, apparently. There was a brilliant flash. There was a sudden darkness. There was a vaguely Rincewind-shaped violet shadow dwindling to a point and winking out. There was nothing at all. Harun the Barbarian crept soundlessly along the corridors, which were lit with a light so violet that it was almost black. Earlier in the afternoon, he had espied a chest by the side of the track while riding through this benighted forest. Its top was invitingly open, displaying much gold. But when he'd leapt off his horse to approach it, the chest had sprouted legs and had gone trotting off into the forest, stopping again a few hundred yards away. Now, after several hours of teasing pursuit, he had lost it in these hell-lit tunnels. The unpleasant carvings and occasional disjointed skeletons he passed held no fear for Harun. They were all in a day's work. He spent a great deal of time in similar situations, seeking gold or demons or distressed virgins, and relieving them respectively of their owners, their lives, and at least one cause of their distress. Observe Harun, as he leaps cat-footed across a suspicious tunnel mouth. Even in this violet light, his skin gleams coppery. There is much gold about his person, in the form of anklets and wristlets, but otherwise he is naked except for a leopard skin loincloth. In his right hand he carried the magical black sword Karing, which was forged from a thunderbolt and has a soul but suffers no scabbard. Harun had stolen it only 3 days before from the impregnable palace of the archmandrite of Bit-Tuni, and he was already regretting it. It was beginning to get on his nerves.
"I tell you, it went down that last passage on the right,"
hissed Karing, in a voice like the scrape of a blade over stone.
Be silent!
"All I said was,
Shut up!
And Two-Flower? He was lost. He knew that. Either the building was much bigger than it looked, or he was now on some wide underground level without having gone down any steps, or, as he was beginning to suspect, the inner dimensions of the place disobeyed a fairly basic rule of architecture by being bigger than the outside. And why all these strange lights? They were 8-sided crystals set at regular intervals in the walls and ceiling, and they shed a rather unpleasant glow that didn't so much illuminate as outline the darkness.
"I don't like it,"
said the picture imp from his box around Two-Flower's neck. Why not? Inquired Two-Flower.
"It's weird."
But you're a demon. Demons can't call things weird. I mean, what's weird to a demon?
"Oh, you know,
Said the demon cautiously.
things. Stuff."
Two-Flower looked up at the ceiling. What was that? He asked. Didn't you hear something?
"Me? Here? No, not a thing,"
The demon insisted. It jerked back into its box and slammed the door. Two-Flower tapped on it. The door opened a crack. It sounded like a stone moving, he explained. The door banged shut. Two-Flower shrugged. Oh, the place is probably falling to... Two-Flower stopped. The reason for this was the bright point of light that had popped into existence a few feet from his eyes. It grew rapidly, and after a few seconds was the tiny bright shape of a man. At this stage, it began to make a noise. Or rather, Two-Flower started to hear the noise it had been making all along. It sounded like a sliver of a scream, caught in one long instant of time. The iridescent man was doll-sized now, a tortured shape tumbling in slow motion while hanging in mid-air. It was beginning to look like Rincewind. The wizard's mouth was open, and his face was brilliantly lit by the light of... what? Now the turning wizard was half man-sized. At that point, the growth was faster. There was a sudden, crowded moment, a rush of air, and an explosion of sound. Rincewind tumbled out of the air, screaming. He hit the floor hard, choked, then rolled over with his head cradled in his arms and his body curled up tightly. When the dust had settled, Two-Flower reached out gingerly and tapped the wizard on the shoulder. The human ball rolled up tighter. "It's me," explained Two-Flower helpfully. In one movement, Rincewind unrolled and bounced up in front of the little man, his hands gripping his shoulders desperately. "Don't say it!" he hissed. "Don't say what?" "The number!" "Number?" "Yes, number! Between 7 and 9. 4 plus 4. What, 8? Rincewind's hands clapped over the man's mouth. "Say it, and we're doomed. Just don't think about it, right? Trust me." After the first age of magic, the disposal of grimoires began to become a severe problem on the Discworld. A spell is still a spell, even when imprisoned temporarily in parchment and ink. It has potency. This isn't a problem while the book's owner still lives. But on his death, the spell book becomes a source of uncontrolled power that cannot easily be defused. In short, spell books leak magic. Various solutions have been tried. Countries near the rim simply loaded down the books of dead mages with leaden pentalphas and threw them over the edge. Near the hub, less satisfactory alternatives were available. Inserting the offending books in canisters of negatively polarised octyron and sinking them in the fathomless depths of the sea was one. Burial in deep caves on land was earlier ruled out after some districts complained of walking trees and five-headed cats. But before long, the magic seeped out, and eventually fishermen complained of shoals of invisible fish or psychic clams. A temporary solution was the construction in various centres of magical lore of large rooms made of denatured octyron, which is impervious to most forms of magic. Here, the more critical grimoires could be stored until their potency had attenuated. That was how there came to be, at Unseen University, the Octavo, greatest of all grimoires, formerly owned by the creator of the universe. It was this book that Rincewind had once opened for a bet. He'd only a second to stare at a page before setting off various alarm spells, but that was time enough for one spell to leap from it and settle in his memory like a toad in a stone. "We're doomed," Rincewind stated. "We've been walking around all night. I tell you, this place is a spider web. It doesn't matter which way we go, we'll end up in the centre. What we've got to do is find this Bel Shamharoth person and he'll let us out," said Two-Flower. Rincewind glared at him in the hellish purple glow. "Find Bel Shamharoth," he said. "Yes, we don't have to get involved." "Find the Soul Render and not get involved? Just give him a nod, I suppose, and ask the way to the exit. Explain things to the sender of Rincewind bit off the end of the word just in time and finished, "You're insane! Hey, come back!" He darted down the passage after Two-Flower, and after a few moments came to a halt with a groan. The violet light was intense here, giving everything new and unpleasant colours. This wasn't a passage. It was a wide room with walls to a number that Rincewind didn't dare to contemplate. Rincewind saw, a little way off, a low altar with the same number of sides as 4 times 2. It didn't occupy the centre of the room, however. The centre was occupied by a huge stone slab with twice as many sides as a square. It looked massive. In the strange light, it appeared to be slightly tilted, with one edge standing proud of the slabs around it. Two-Flower was standing on it. "Hey, Rincewind, look what's here!" The luggage came ambling down one of the other passages that radiated from the room. "That's great," said Rincewind. "Fine. It can lead us out of here. Now." Two-Flower was already rummaging in the chest. "Yes," he said, "after I've taken a few pictures, just let me fit the attachment. I said now." Rincewind stopped. Harun the Barbarian was standing in the passage mouth directly opposite him, a great black sword held in one ham-sized fist. "You?" said Harun uncertainly. "Aha, yes," said Rincewind. "Harun, isn't it? Long time no see. What brings you here?" Harun pointed to the luggage. "That," he said, Then he added, in a tone that combined statement, claim, threat and ultimatum, "Mine." "It belongs to Two Flower here," said Rincewind. "Here's a tip. Don't touch it." It dawned on him that this was precisely the wrong thing to say, but Harun had already pushed Two Flower away and was reaching for the luggage, which sprouted legs, backed away, and raised its lid threateningly. In the uncertain light, Rincewind thought he could see rows of enormous teeth, white as bleached beechwood. "Harun," he said quickly, "there's something I ought to tell you."
What?
He said. "It's about numbers. Look, you know if you add 7 and 1, or 3 and 5, or take 2 from 10, and you get a number, while you're here, don't say it, and we might all stand a chance of getting out of here alive." "Who is he?" asked Two Flower. He was holding a cage in his hands, dredged from the bottommost depths of the luggage. It appeared to be full of sulking pink lizards.
I am Harun.
said Harun proudly. Then he looked at Rincewind.
What?
He said. "Just don't say it, okay?" said Rincewind. The sword in Harun's hand suddenly spoke in a voice like a claw being scraped across glass.
"Strange. Why can't he say 8, 8, hate, 8, 8,
said the echoes. And although they became softer, they refused to die away. They bounced from wall to wall, crossing and recrossing, and the violet light flickered in time with the sound.
You did it!
Screamed Rincewind. "I said you shouldn't say 8! He stopped, appalled at himself. But the word was out now and joined its colleagues in the general susurration. The air suddenly seemed to be thicker than treacle. A charge of magic, bigger than he had ever seen, was building up. When he moved, in painful slow motion, his limbs left trails of golden sparks that traced their shape in the air. Behind him, there was a rumble as the great octagonal slab rose into the air, exposing the blackness of a pit, hung for a moment on one edge, and crashed down on the floor. Something thin and black snaked out of the pit and wrapped itself around Rincewind's ankle. He screamed as he landed heavily on the vibrating flagstones. The tentacle started to pull him across the floor. There was a noise like a singing saw, and the pressure on Rincewind's legs abruptly ceased. He turned his head and saw Harun, crouched by the pit, his sword a blur as it hacked at the tentacles racing out towards him. Two Flower was feverishly attaching the cage of subdued lizards to the picture box, which he'd mounted on a tripod. "I've just got to get a picture of this," he muttered. "It's stupendous. Can you hear me, Imp?" The picture imp opened his tiny hatch, glanced momentarily at the scene around the pit, and vanished into the box. Rincewind jumped up as something touched his leg and brought his heel down on a questing tentacle. "Come on," he said. "Hey," Two Flower said, "it's got my luggage." Before Rincewind could restrain him, Two Flower ran around the edge of the pit to the box, which was being dragged across the floor while its lid snapped ineffectually at the tentacle that held it. Harun himself was already an indistinct shape amid the tightening coils. Even as Rincewind stared in horror, the hero's sword was wrenched from his grasp and hurled against a wall. Rincewind didn't move. He was looking at the thing rising out of the pit. It was an enormous eye, and it was staring directly at him. He whimpered as a tentacle fastened itself around his waist. The words of the spell rose unbidden in his throat. He opened his mouth as in a dream. Another tentacle shot out like a whip and coiled around his throat, choking him. Staggering and gasping, Rincewind was dragged across the floor. One flailing arm caught Two Flower's picture box as it skittered past on its tripod. He snatched it up instinctively. If only he could get enough room to swing it against the eye. In front of him, the lizards stirred in their cages on the picture box. Rincewind saw that they had overlarge tails that were bluish-white and, he realised, throbbing alarmingly. As he was drawn towards the eye, the terror-struck Rincewind raised the box protectively and at the same time heard the picture imp say,
"They're about ripe now. Can't hold them any longer. Everyone smile, please."
There was a flash of light so white and so bright, it didn't seem like light at all. Bel Shamharoth screamed. The tentacles, hurling their various cargoes around the room, bunched up protectively in front of the abused eye. The whole mass dropped into the pit, and a moment later, the big slab was snatched up and slammed into place, leaving a number of thrashing limbs trapped around the edge. Two Flower was in a crumpled heap against the wall, but at least he was groaning. The wizard pulled himself across the floor painfully and whispered, "What the hell was that?" "Why were they so bright?" muttered Two Flower. "God's my head." "Too bright?" said Rincewind. He looked across the floor to the cage on the picture box. The lizards inside, now noticeably thinner, were watching him with interest. "The salamanders," moaned Two Flower. "The picture'll be overexposed, I know it." "Salamanders?" "Of course. Standard attachment." Rincewind tried to remember the little he knew about them. They were magical creatures. They also had no mouths, since they subsisted entirely on the nourishing quality of the octarine wavelength in the Discworld's sunlight, which they absorbed through their skins. Rincewind nodded grimly. With all the octarine light in this magical place, the creatures had been gorging themselves, and then nature had taken its course. He looked around at a sudden grinding noise, and a voice like a carving knife cutting through silk said, "This is very undignified."
Shut up,
said Hurun. He was using Karing to lever the top off the altar. He looked up at Rincewind and grinned.
Mighty magic,
commented the barbarian, pushing down heavily on the complaining sword with a hand the size of a ham.
Now we share the treasure, eh?
How do you know there's treasure in there? Rincewind said. Hurun heaved and managed to hook his fingers under the stone. He gritted his teeth. The stone swung up and landed heavily on the floor. Something struck Rincewind's hand heavily. It was a piece of stone with 5 + 3 sides. He looked up at the ceiling. Should it be sagging like that? Hurun hummed a little tune as he began to pull crumbling leather from the desecrated altar. The air crackled, fluoresced, hummed. Intangible winds gripped the wizard's robe, flapping it out in eddies of blue and green sparks. Around Rincewind's head, mad, half-formed spirits howled and gibbered as they were sucked past. Two Flower staggered up, bent double in the teeth of the astral gale. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. Rincewind half-turned. Immediately the howling wind caught him, nearly pitching him over. Poltergeist eddies spinning in the rushing air snatched at his feet. Hurun's arm shot out and caught him. A moment later, he and Two Flower had been dragged into the lee of the ravaged altar and lay panting on the floor. "We're doomed," murmured Rincewind, while overhead the roof cracked and shifted. Hurun glanced up at the widening cracks in the ceiling and sighed. Then he put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled. His warhorse cantered through a creaking archway and reared up by its master, its mane streaming in the gale. The barbarian pulled himself to his feet and slung his treasure bags into a sack that hung from the saddle, then hauled himself onto the beast's back. He reached down and grabbed Two Flower by the scruff of his neck, dragging him across the saddle tree. As the horse turned around, Rincewind took a desperate leap and landed behind Hurun, who raised no objection. The horse pounded sure-footed along the tunnels, leaping sudden slides of rubble and adroitly sidestepping huge stones as they thundered down from the straining roof. Rincewind, clinging on grimly, looked behind. Close behind, speeding through the flickering violet light, were a large, ominous-looking chest and a picture box that skittered along dangerously on its 3 legs. They reached the outer air a moment before the octagonal arch finally broke and smashed into the flags. Behind them, a column of dust rose as the temple collapsed in on itself. but they didn't look back. Two-Flower was helping the heroes sort through the treasure stolen from the temple. Rincewind was trying to shut his ears to the grating voice behind him. It was no use.
And then I belonged to the Pasha of Durat and played a prominent part in the Battle of the Great Neff, which is where I received the slight nick you may have noticed, some 2/3 of the way up my blade,
Corinne was saying from its temporary home in a tussock.
Am I boring you?
Oh, no, not at all. It's all very interesting, said Rincewind, with his eyes still on Harun. How trustworthy would he be? Here they were, out in the wilds. There were trolls about. Two-Flower hurried over to the wizard. I had a great idea, he burbled. Yeah, said Rincewind wearily. Why don't we get Harun to accompany us? Two-Flower looked amazed. How did you know? He said. Harun ceased stuffing silverware into his saddlebags and grinned encouragingly at them. Then his eyes strayed back to the luggage. If we had him with us, who'd attack us? Said Two-Flower. Rincewind scratched his chin. Harun? He suggested. But we saved his life in the temple. Well, if by attack you mean kill, said Rincewind, I don't think he'd do that. He's not that sort. He'd just rob us and tie us up and leave us for the wolves, I expect. Oh, come on! Look, this is real life, snapped Rincewind. Then the answer hit him. He looked from Harun to the picture box. I've got an idea, he said. I mean, what is it heroes really want? Gold? Said Two-Flower. No, I mean really want. I don't quite understand. Rincewind picked up the picture box. Harun, he said. Come over here, will you? The days passed peacefully. True, a small band of bridge trolls tried to ambush them on one occasion, and a party of brigands nearly caught them unawares one night, but unwisely tried to investigate the luggage before slaughtering the sleepers. Harun demanded and got double pay for both occasions. If any harm comes to us, said Rincewind, then there will be no one to operate the magic box. No more pictures of Harun. You understand? Harun nodded, his eyes fixed on the latest picture. It showed Harun striking a heroic pose with one foot on a heap of slain trolls.
Me and you and little friend Two-Flowers, we all get on okay, he said. Also, tomorrow maybe we get a better profile, okay? He carefully wrapped the picture in troll skin and stowed it in his saddlebag along with the others. You win, said Fate, pushing the heap of souls across the gaming table. The assembled gods relaxed. There will be other games, he added. The lady smiled into two eyes that were like holes in the universe. The Lure of the Wirm. It was called the Wirmberg, and it rose almost 1/2 of a mile above the Green Valley, a mountain huge, grey, and upside down. At its base, it was a mere score of yards across. Then it rose through clinging cloud, curving gracefully outward like an upturned trumpet, until it was truncated by a plateau fully 1/4 of a mile across. There was a tiny forest up there, its greenery cascading over the lip. There were buildings. There was even a small river, tumbling over the edge in a waterfall so wind-whipped that it reached the ground as rain. There were also a number of cave mouths a few yards below the plateau. They had a crudely carved regular look about them, so that on this crisp autumn morning the Wirmberg hung over the clouds like a giant's dovecot. This would mean that the doves had a wingspan slightly in excess of 40 yards. I knew it, said Rincewind. We're in a strong magical field. Two-Flower and Harun looked around the little hollow where they'd made their noonday halt. Harun shrugged and went back to oiling his biceps. Looks all right to me, he said. Try tossing a coin, said Rincewind.
Hurun reached into his pouch and withdrew a Zishalotti leaden quarter iotum and balanced it on a purple thumbnail.
You call,
he said.
heads or...
He inspected the obverse with an air of intense concentration.
some sort of fish with legs?
Hurun grinned and flicked his thumb. The iotum rose, spinning. Edge, said Rincewind.
Oh, edge it is, said Hurun. So what?
Try it again, Rincewind suggested. Hurun pulled out a fistful of coins. The first two landed in the usual manner, so did the fourth. The third landed on its edge and balanced there. The fifth turned into a small yellow caterpillar and crawled away. The sixth, upon reaching its zenith, vanished with a sharp spang. Rincewind sighed. He'd been dreading this. We've strayed into a zone with a high magical index, he said. Don't ask me how. Once upon a time, a really powerful magic field must have been generated here, and we're feeling the after effects. Precisely, said a passing bush.
Let's get out of here, said Hurun.
What are they doing now?
Asked the old man. The young woman glanced at the scrying glass. Heading rimwards at speed, she reported. By the way, they've still got that box on legs. The old man chuckled.
Sapient pearwood, he said. Remarkable. Yes, I think we'll have that. Please see to it, my dear, before they go beyond your power, perhaps.
Silence, or... Ah, what a liaison, said the old man. In this dim light there was something odd about the way he was slumped in the stone chair.
You killed me once already, remember?
She stood up, tossing back her hair scornfully. It was red, flecked with gold. Erect, Eliezer Wirrambidder was entirely a magnificent sight. She was also almost naked, except for a couple of mere scraps of the lightest chainmail and riding boots of iridescent dragonhide. Eliezer snorted and strode out of the hall. Her father didn't bother to watch her go. As a wizard, even a dead wizard, his optic nerves had long since become attuned to seeing into levels and dimensions far removed from common reality, and were therefore somewhat inefficient at observing the merely mundane. Besides, since he was now suspended in the narrow space between the living world and the dark shadow world of death, he could survey the whole of causality itself. Eliezer strode down the worn steps that led into the hollow heart of the Wirramberg, followed by half a dozen riders. Would this be the opportunity? Perhaps here was the key to break the deadlock, the key to the throne of the Wirramberg. It was rightfully hers, of course, but tradition said that only a man could rule the Wirramberg. That irked Eliezer. And when she was angry, the power flowed stronger, and the dragons were especially big and ugly. If she had a man, things would be different. Someone who, for preference, was a big, strapping lad, but short on brains. Someone who would do what he was told. The biggest of the three now fleeing the Dragonlands might do. And if it turned out that he wouldn't, well, dragons were always hungry. The stairway passed through a stone arch and ended in a narrow ledge near the roof of the great cavern where the Wirrams roosted. Sunbeams from the myriad entrances around the walls crisscrossed the dusty gloom like amber rods. Below, they revealed nothing but a thin haze. Above... The walking rings started so close to Eliezer's head that she could reach up and touch one. They stretched away in their thousands across the upturned acres of the cavern roof. Yet they were as nothing compared to the 88 major rings that clustered near the apex of the dome. From them, the dragons sense Eliezer's presence. Air swishes around the cavern as 88 pairs of wings unfold like a complicated puzzle. Great heads with multifaceted eyes peer down at her. The beasts are still faintly transparent. While the men around her take their hook boots from the rack, Eliezer bends her mind to the task of full visualization. Above her in the musty air, the dragons become fully visible, bronze scales dully reflecting the sunbeam shafts. Now she too buckles on the hook boots, and turns a graceful cartwheel to bring their hooks with a faint clang against a couple of the walking rings in the ceiling. Only now it is the floor. The world has changed. Now she is standing on the edge of a deep bowl or crater floored with the little rings, across which the dragon riders are already strolling with a pendulum gait. In the centre of the bowl their huge mounts wait among the herd. Far above are the distant rocks of the cavern floor, discoloured by centuries of dragon droppings. Liesa sets off towards her own dragon, Aleolith, who turns his great head towards her. She swings down the mounting ladder and lands with her legs locked around Aleolith's leathery neck. The dragon spreads his wings and drops.
"They're gaining!"
screamed Rincewind. He bent even lower over his horse's neck. Two-Flower was trying to keep up, while at the same time craning to look at the flying beasts.
"All my life I've wanted to see dragons!" he cried.
"From the inside!" shouted Rincewind.
"Shut up and ride!"
Rincewind whipped his horse and stared at the wood ahead, trying to drag it closer by sheer willpower. He heard the clap of wings before shadows folded around him. He felt the white-hot stab of pain as something sharp scored a line across his shoulders. Behind him, Harun screamed. The barbarian had vaulted down into the heather and had drawn the black sword, Kring.
"No bloody lizard does that to me!"
he roared. Rincewind reached the shelter of the trees, where a low branch promptly knocked him out of the saddle. When he awoke, a dragon was hanging from a branch of a large oak tree several 100 feet away. Its bronze-gold wings were tightly wrapped around its body, but the long equine head turned this way and that at the end of a remarkably prehensile neck. It was scanning the forest. It was also semi-transparent. Although the sun glinted off its scales, Rincewind could clearly make out the outlines of the branches behind it. On one of them, a man was sitting. He appeared to be naked, except for a pair of high boots, a leather holdall in the region of his groin, and a high-crested helmet. Rincewind wriggled sideways until foliage masked the oak and its occupants. Then he scrambled to his feet and haired off between the trees. When he'd put about a mile between him and the dragon, he stopped and collapsed against a tree, which then spoke to him. "Psst," it said. Dreading what he might see, Rincewind let his gaze slide upwards. It fixed on a black sword thrust straight through the branch above Rincewind's head.
"Don't just stand there," said the sword. "Pull me out."
"What?" said Rincewind.
"Pull me out,"
repeated Kring. "What happened to the others?" said Rincewind.
"Oh, the dragons got them, and the horses, and that box thing. Me too, except that Harun dropped me. What a stroke of luck for you. I expect you'll be in a hurry to rescue them," it added.
"Yes, well..."
"So, if you'll just pull me out, we can be off."
Rincewind scrambled up the tree and inched along the branch. Kring was buried very firmly in the wood. He gripped the pommel and heaved until the blade slid free. Back on the ground, he decided to break the news. "I really don't think rescue's a good idea," he said. "I think we'd better head back to a city, to raise a search party."
"The dragon's headed hubwards," said Kring. "However, I suggest we start with the one in the trees over there."
"Sorry, but..."
"If you don't stop arguing, I'll chop your head off."
Rincewind saw his own arm snap up until the shimmering blade was humming a mere inch from his throat. He tried to force his fingers to let go. They wouldn't. Bronze Persephone rumbled deep in his throat. Cassedra, the dragon rider, leant forward and squinted across the clearing. "I see him," he said. He swung himself down easily from branch to branch and landed lightly on the tussocky grass, drawing his sword. The approaching man was armed, but the dragon rider observed with some interest the strange way in which he held the sword in front of him at arm's length, as though embarrassed to be seen in its company. Later, Cassedra remembered only two things about the fight. He recalled the uncanny way in which the wizard's sword curved up and caught his own blade, with a shock that jerked it out of his grip. The other thing, and it was this, he averred, that led to his downfall, was that the wizard was covering his eyes with one hand. Cassedra jumped back to avoid another thrust and fell full length on the turf. With a snarl, Persephone unfolded his great wings and launched himself from his tree. A moment later, the wizard was standing over Cassedra, shouting, "Tell it that if it singes me, I'll let the sword go." The tip of the black sword was hovering over Cassedra's throat. "Persephone!" Cassedra shouted. The dragon pulled out of the dive that would have removed Rincewind's head and flapped ponderously back to the tree. "Talk!" screamed Rincewind. "What would you like me to say?" "Where are my friends?" "I expect they've been taken back to the Wurmberg." "Right then," said Rincewind as diffidently as he could manage. "You'd better take me to this Wurmberg of yours, hadn't you?" "Oh, all right," said Cassedra sulkily. He wriggled out from under the sword and waved at the dragon, which took wing again and glided in towards them. Rincewind looked at the dragon. He could quite clearly see through it to the crushed grass on which it lay, but when he gingerly touched a scale that was a mere golden sheen on thin air, it felt solid enough. "I didn't know dragons could be seen through," he said. Cassedra shrugged. "Didn't you?" he said. He swung himself astride the dragon awkwardly, because Rincewind was hanging onto his belt. Once uncomfortably aboard, the wizard moved his white-knuckle grip to a convenient piece of harness and prodded Cassedra lightly with the sword. Persephone clawed its way into the air with a series of vertebrae-shattering bounds. At the top of its last leap, the wide wings unfolded with a snap and spread out with a thump which shook the trees. Then the ground was gone, dropping away in a series of gentle jerks. Persephone was suddenly rising gracefully, the afternoon sunlight gleaming off wings that were still no more than a golden film. Rincewind made the mistake of glancing downwards and found himself looking through the dragon to the treetops below. Far below. His stomach shrank at the sight. Cassedra half turned and shouted in his ear, "Behold, the Wurmberg!" Rincewind saw the impossibly inverted mountain rearing out of the deep forested valley like a trumpet in a tub of moss. Even at this distance, he could make out the faint octarine glow in the air that must be indicating a stable magic aura of at least, he gasped, several milliprime, at least. "Oh, no," he said. He averted his eyes quickly and realised that he could now no longer see the ground through the dragon. As they glided around in a wide circle towards the Wurmberg, it was definitely taking on a more solid form, as if the creature's body was filling with a gold mist. By the time the Wurmberg was in front of them, the dragon was as real as a rock. The flared plateau of the upturned mountain drifted towards them. The dragon didn't even slow. Rincewind saw a cave mouth. Persephone skimmed towards it. There was a brief vision of rock flashing past, blurred by speed. Then the dragon was inside a cave, but bigger than any cave had a right to be. There were other dragons, gold, silver, black, white, flapping across the sun-shafted air. High in the domed roof of the cavern, scores of others hung from huge rings, their wings wrapped bat-like around their bodies. There were men up there too. Rincewind swallowed hard when he saw them, because they were walking on that broad expanse of ceiling like flies. Then he made out the thousands of tiny rings that studded the ceiling. A number of inverted men were watching Persephone's flight with interest. Rincewind swallowed again. "Well," he asked in a whisper, "any suggestions?"
"Obviously, you attack,"
said Corinne scornfully. "Why didn't I think of that?" said Rincewind. "Could it be because they all have crossbows?" Before Corinne could reply, Persephone reared in mid-air and alighted on one of the large rings, which rocked alarmingly. Men were converging on the ring from all directions, walking with a swaying motion as their hooked boots engaged the ceiling rings. There were more boots on a rack that hung in a small platform built on the side of the perch ring. Before Rincewind could stop him, the dragon rider had leapt from the creature's back to land on the platform, where he stood grinning at the wizard's discomfiture. There was a small expressive sound made by a number of crossbows being cocked. "Surrender," said Cassidra. Rincewind opened his mouth to do so. Kring hummed a warning, and agonising waves of pain shot up his arm. "Never!" he squeaked. The pain stopped. "Of course he won't," boomed an expansive voice behind him. "He's a hero, isn't he?" Rincewind turned and looked into a pair of hairy nostrils. They belonged to a heavily built young man, hanging nonchalantly from the ceiling by his boots. "What is your name, hero?" said the man. Agony shot up Rincewind's arm. I'm Rincewind of Ankh," he managed to gasp. "And I am Leok Dragon Lord," said the hanging man. "You have come to challenge me in mortal combat." Well, no, I didn't. Cassidra, help our hero into a pair of hook boots. I'm sure he's anxious to get started." "No, look, I just came here to find my friends. I'm sure there's no—" Rincewind began, as the dragon rider guided him firmly onto the platform, pushed him onto a seat, and proceeded to strap hook boots to his feet. "You will see your friends soon enough," said Dragon Lord airily. "Show him how to reach the rings, Cassidra."
"Look what you've got me into,"
Rincewind hissed. Kring vibrated in his hand.
"Remember that I am a magic sword,"
it hummed. "Climb the ladder and grab a ring," said the dragon rider. "Then bring your feet up until the hooks catch." He helped the protesting wizard climb until he was hanging upside down, robe tucked into his breeches, Kring dangling from one hand. A dragon rider handed Leok a long shape wrapped in red silk. "We fight to the death," he said. "And I suppose I earn my freedom if I win?" said Rincewind. "Don't be naive." Rincewind took a deep breath. "I suppose I should warn you that this is a magic sword." Leok let the red silk wrapping drop away into the gloom and flourished a jet-black blade. "What a coincidence," he said, and lunged. Rincewind went rigid with fright, but his arm swung out as Kring shot forward. The swords met in an explosion of octarine light. Leok swung himself backwards, his eyes narrowing. Kring leapt past his guard, and although the Dragon Lord's sword jerked up to deflect most of the force, the result was a thin red line across its master's torso. With a growl, he launched himself at the wizard, boots clattering as he slid from ring to ring. The swords met again in another violent discharge of magic, and at the same time, Leok brought his other hand down against Rincewind's head, jarring him so hard that one foot jerked out of its ring. A grinning Leok swung back and brought his sword around in a lazy arc. Rincewind ducked. The blade hissed coldly through the air beside his head and entered the rock of the cavern roof without slowing. With that desperation only available to the really terrified, Rincewind uncoiled like a snake and launched himself across the space between them. He locked both hands around the Dragon Lord's sword arm and wrenched.
Sorry, Marco, I don't understand what you mean.
Already overburdened, slid out of the rock. He plunged down, swung wildly, and ended up dangling with his hands gripping the Dragon Lord's arm. "Let go, damn you!" Leok screamed. "Or we'll both die!" Rincewind said nothing. "Shoot him!" bellowed Leok. Out of the corner of his eye, Rincewind saw several crossbows levelled at him. Leok chose that moment to flail down with his free hand, and a fistful of rings stabbed into the wizard's fingers. He let go. Two-Flower grabbed the bars and pulled himself up.
"See anything?" said Hurun.
"Just clouds." Hurun lifted him down again and sat on the edge of one of the wooden beds. "Bloody hell," he said. Don't despair, said Two Flower. I expect it's all some sort of misunderstanding. I expect they'll release us soon, and when we get back, we can say we've seen dragons. What about that, eh? Dragons don't exist, said Harun flatly. I don't know what we're seeing, but they aren't dragons. But they carried us up in the air. In that hall there must have been hundreds. I expect it was just magic, said Harun dismissively. Well, they look like dragons, said Two Flower, an air of defiance about him. I always wanted to see dragons ever since I was a little lad. Dragons flying around in the sky, breathing flames. But there was something wrong with these dragons. They were too small and sleek compared to the ones in his mind's eye. Dragons ought to be big and green and clawed and exotic and fire-breathing. Big and green with long, sharp... Harun, he said. There was a snore from the other bunk. At that moment, the door was flung back. Half a dozen guards hurtled through it, crossbows at the ready. A woman strode into the room. Not many women can stride convincingly, but she managed it. She glanced briefly at Two Flower, as one might look at a piece of furniture, then glared down at the man on the bed. She drew a slim black dagger from her belt and stabbed downward. Before it was halfway through its arc, Harun's right hand moved so fast that it appeared to travel between 2 points in space without at any time occupying the intervening air. It closed around the woman's wrist with a dull smack. His other hand groped feverishly for a sword that wasn't there. Harun awoke. He said, looking up at the woman with a puzzled frown. Then he caught sight of the bowman. Let go, said the woman. Harun released his grip slowly. She stepped back, massaging her wrist. So, she said at last, you pass the first test. What is your name, barbarian? I am Harun of Chimeria. And you? Eliezer Dragonlady. You are the lord of this place? That remains to be seen. You have the look about you of a hired sword, Harun of Chimeria. I could use you, if you pass the tests, of course. There are 3 of them. You have passed the first. What are the other... Harun paused. His lips moved soundlessly, and then he hazarded, 2. Perilous. Excuse me, said Two Flower. And if I fail these tests, said Harun. If you had failed the first test, you would now be dead. This may be considered a typical penalty. Look, began Two Flower. Eliezer spared him a brief glance. Take that away, she said. 2 of the guards shouldered their bows, grasped Two Flower by the elbows, and lifted him off the ground. Then they trotted smartly through the doorway. They hurried down the corridor, stopped in front of another door, and dragged it open. Two Flower landed in a heap of what might once have been straw. The door banged shut, its echoes punctuated by the sound of bolts being slammed home. In the other cell, Harun had barely blinked. Okay, he said. What is the second test? You must kill my 2 brothers. Good fighters, are they? Renowned. So, in return for all this, you will wed me and become Lord of the Wittenberg. Two Flower sat on his straw and stared into the darkness. He wondered how long he'd been there, hours at least. He tried to think of something else. Grass, trees, fresh air, dragons. Dragons. There was the faintest of scrabblings in the darkness. Two Flower fervently found himself wishing for a light. A gout of flame rolled past his head and struck the far wall. As the rocks flashed into furnace heat, he looked up at the dragon that now occupied more than half the cell. I obey, Lord, said a voice in his head. By the glow of the crackling, spitting stone, Two Flower looked into his own reflection in 2 enormous green eyes. Beyond them, the dragon was as multi-hued, horned, spiked, and lithe as the one in his memory. A real dragon. Its folded wings were wide enough to scrape the wall on both sides of the room. It lay with him between its talons. "Obey?" he said.
Of course, Lord.
The glow faded away. Two-Flower pointed a trembling finger at where he remembered the door to be and said, "Open it." The dragon raised its huge head. Again the ball of flame rolled out. The door fell in two pieces in the passage beyond. The flame winked out with a suddenness that was almost as startling as its arrival. Two-Flower stepped gingerly over the cooling door and looked up and down the corridor. It was empty. The dragon followed. The heavy door frame caused it some minor difficulty, which it overcame with a swing of its shoulders. "How did you get there?" said Two-Flower.
You summoned me, Master.
"I don't remember doing that."
In your mind. You called me up. In your mind.
Thought the dragon patiently. "You mean I just thought of you and there you were?"
Yes.
"It was magic?"
Yes.
"But I've thought about dragons all my life."
In this place, the frontier between thought and reality is probably a little confused. All I know is that once I was not, and then you thought of me, and then I was. Therefore, of course, I am yours to command."
"Good grief. Can you fly?"
"Of course."
"What is your name, dragon?" said Two-Flower.
"I don't know."
"I think I shall call you Nine Reeds."
"That is my name, then."
They waded through the all-encroaching dust in a series of huge, dark-pillared halls which had been carved out of the solid rock. Then Two-Flower saw the path, leading away into yet another dark tunnel mouth. Someone had been using it regularly, and recently. It was a deep, narrow trail in the grey blanket. Two-Flower followed it. It led through still more lofty halls and ended at a pair of green bronze doors. In front of Two-Flower, at chest height, was a small handle shaped like a brass dragon. When he touched it, the doors swung open. The chamber beyond the door was lit by a pale green glow. Stacked around the walls, each on its own marble shelf, were tier upon tier of coffins. In the centre of the room was a stone chair on a raised dais, and it contained a slumped figure which didn't move, but said in a brittle old voice,
"Come in, young man."
Two-Flower stepped forward.
"I'm dead, you know."
Came a voice from what Two-Flower fervently hoped was a head in conversational tones.
"I expect you can tell."
Said Two-Flower.
"Obvious, isn't it?"
Agreed the voice.
"You'd be Two-Flower, wouldn't you? That's a fine-looking dragon, by the way."
"It is rather good. It just turned up," said Two-Flower.
"It turned up," said the voice. "You summoned it?"
"Yes. Well, all I did..."
"You have the power."
"All I did was think of it."
"That's what the power is. Have I already told you that I am Grisha the First? Anyway, yes, the power. It summons dragons, you know."
"But how does it? I've been thinking about dragons all my life, but this is the first time one's turned up."
Well, you see, the truth of the matter is that dragons have never existed as you, and until I was poisoned some 3 months ago, I understand existence. I'm talking about the true dragon, Draconis nobilis, you understand. The true dragon is a creature of such refinement of spirit that they can only take on form in this world if they are conceived by the most skilled imagination. And even then, the said imagination must be in some place heavily impregnated with magic, which helps to weaken the walls between the world of the seen and unseen. Then the dragons pop through. When I was alive, I could imagine up to 500 dragons at a time. Now, Eliezer, the most skilled of my children, can barely imagine 50 rather nondescript creatures. So much for progressive education. Now yours is almost as good as some of mine used to be. A sight for sore eyes. Not that I have any to speak of now.
Two-Flower said hurriedly,
You keep saying you're dead. Well, the dead, they, don't talk much, as a rule. My daughter poisoned me, of course. It is the generally accepted method of succession in our family, but
the corpse sighed.
It soon became obvious that none of my 3 children is sufficiently powerful to wrest the lordship of the Wirrenberg from the other 2. A most unsatisfactory arrangement. So I resolved to remain alive in an unofficial capacity, which of course annoys them immensely. So it was one of them that kidnapped us. Eleazar, my daughter. Her power is strongest, you know. My son's dragons are incapable of flying more than a few miles before they fade.
Fade? I did notice that we could see through the one that brought us here, said Two-Flower. I thought that was a bit odd.
Of course, said Garisha. The power only works near the Wirrenberg. As the dragons fly further away, they begin to dwindle. But I can see I mustn't keep you. I expect you'll be wanting to rescue your friend.
Harun?
Not him, the skinny wizard. My son Leok is trying to hack him to pieces.
Where is he?
Just follow the pathway in the dust.
Two-Flower ran along the tunnels, with the dragon loping along easily behind him. But soon he was leaning against a pillar, completely out of breath.
Why don't you fly?
Said Nine Reeds inside his head. The dragon spread its wings and gave an experimental flap. Two-Flower stared for a moment, then clambered quickly onto the beast's neck. Soon they were airborne, the dragon skimming along easily a few feet from the floor and leaving a billowing cloud of dust in its wake. A sharp turn sent them soaring out of a tunnel mouth in the side of a vast cavern. There were rocks far below, and up above were broad shafts of light from great holes near the roof. A lot of activity on the ceiling, too. As Nine Reeds hovered, Two-Flower peered up. One of the shapes far above detached itself from the roof and began to grow larger. Rincewind was dropping to the distant guano-speckled rocks. His brain reeled with the thought. The words of the spell picked just that moment to surface from the depths of his mind, as they always did in times of crisis. Why not say us? They seemed to urge. What have you got to lose? Rincewind waved a hand in the gathering slipstream.
Ashonai,
he called. Eberis, he intoned.
Urshuring Kvandi Pithan Ungarad Ferin Gamali.
As the words blazed their rainbow colours around him, he flung his hands back and prepared to say the 8th and final word that would appear in coruscating octarine and seal the spell. Then the breath was knocked out of him. A pair of arms locked around his waist, and the whole world jerked sideways as the dragon rose out of its long dive. Two-Flower laughed triumphantly.
Got him!
And the dragon, curving gracefully at the top of his flight, gave a lazy flip of his wings and soared through the cave mouth into the morning air. In a wide green meadow on the lush tablelands that was the top of the Wirrenberg, the dragons and their riders formed a wide circle. They were all watching the figures clustered in the centre of the grassy arena. The group contained a number of senior dragon lords, and among them were Leok and his brother Eliates. Slightly to one side stood Eleazar and Harun. Between the two factions stood the Wirrenberg's hereditary lawmaster.
I challenge you, said Harun, glaring at the brothers, both at once.
Leok and Eliates exchanged looks. Leok scowled. You arrogant barbarian. The lawmaster put out a blue-veined hand. As the challenged parties, my lords Leok and Eliates have choice of weapons.
Dragons,
they said together. Harun stepped back, shaking his head.
Oh, no, he said. I'd rather be dead than fight on one of those things.
Die, then, said the lawmaster. Harun turned to Eliezer.
Don't I even get a sword? He pleaded. A knife, even?
No, she said. I'm sorry.
You're sorry?
A boom of wings made Harun spin around. Liuk's dragon was already airborne. As it swooped low over the turf, a billow of flame shot from its mouth, scoring a black streak across the grass that rushed towards Harun. At the last minute, he pushed Eliezer aside and felt the wild pain of the flame as he dived for safety. He rolled as he hit the ground and flipped onto his feet again. The other dragon came in from one side, and Harun was forced to take a standing jump to escape the flame. Liuk came in for a second run, but slower this time to allow for the big man's unexpected agility. As the ground drifted up, he saw the barbarian standing stock still, chest heaving, arms hanging loosely by his sides, an easy target. As his dragon swooped away, Liuk turned his head, expecting to see a dreadfully big cinder. There was nothing there. Puzzled, Liuk turned back. Harun, heaving himself over the dragon's shoulder scales with one hand and beating out his flaming hair with the other, presented himself to his view. Liuk's hand flew to his dagger, but pain had sharpened Harun's excellent reflexes to needlepoint. A backhand blow hammered into the Dragon Lord's wrist, sending the dagger arcing away towards the ground, and another caught the man full on the chin. The dragon was only a few yards above the grass. This turned out to be fortunate, because at the moment Liuk lost consciousness, the dragon winked out of existence. Eliezer hurried across the grass and helped Harun stagger to his feet. Liuk went on sleeping soundly. That was really fantastic, she said. One down, one to go.
Yeah, but what happened?
The dragons.
Yeah?
They're imaginary.
Like all these imaginary burns on my arm, you mean?
Just listen, will you? Unless my brother is conscious, his dragon can't exist. It's got no pathway through this...
Run!
shouted Harun. He threw her away from him and flung himself flat on the ground as Eliate's dragon thundered by, leaving another smoking scar across the turf. Harun scrambled to his feet and set off flat out for the woods at the edge of the arena. No dragon would be able to fly through them. It didn't try. Liates brought his mount in to land on the turf a few yards away and dismounted casually. The dragon folded its wings. I can burn you out, said Eliates after a while. The bushes remained motionless. Perhaps you're in that holly bush over there. The holly bush became a waxy ball of flame. I'm sure I can see movement in those ferns. The ferns became mere skeletons of white ash. The dragon continued through the spinney, incinerating every likely-looking bush and clump of ferns. Eliates waited. Harun dropped from a tree and landed running, a dead branch in his hands. Eliates' sword came up wickedly to be caught on the branch. Then Harun cannoned into him, and the two men sprawled on the ground. The dragon roared and crashed through the bushes as it tried to turn around. Eliates screamed as Harun brought a knee upwards with anatomical precision, but managed a wild blow that re-broke the barbarian's nose for him. Harun scrambled to his feet, to find himself looking up into the wild horse face of the dragon, its nostrils distended. He lashed out with a foot and caught Eliates, who was trying to stand up, on the side of his head. The man slumped. The dragon vanished. Harun slung the unconscious dragon lord over his shoulder and set off at a trot back to the arena. Halfway there, he found Liuk still sprawled on the ground. He stooped and with a grunt hoisted the man onto his vacant shoulder. Eliezer and the lawmaster were waiting on a raised dais at one end of the meadow. Kill them, she said.
Killing unconscious people isn't right.
Eliezer snorted. Then I shall banish them, she said. Will that satisfy you?
Yes.
Harun looked around.
Where's the next test, then?
I warn you that it is perilous. If you pass, however, you will become Lord of the Wurmberg and my husband."
"Am I to be weaponless again?"
said Hurun. Eleazar reached up and removed her helmet, letting the coils of red hair tumble out. Then she unfastened the brooch of her robe. Underneath, she was naked. As Hurun's gaze swept over her, his mind began to operation two notional counting machines. One assessed the gold in her bangles, the other was plugged straight into his libido. Both produced tallies that pleased him mightily. As she raised a hand and proffered a glass of wine, she smiled and said, "I think not."
"He didn't attempt to rescue you," Rincewind pointed out. He clung desperately to Two Flower's waist as the dragon circled slowly, tilting the world at a dangerous angle. In front of them, the Wurmberg hung against the sky. "What can you see?" said Two Flower to the dragon.
"I see fighting on the top of the mountain," came the gentle reply.
"See," said Two Flower, "Hurun's probably fighting for his life at this very moment."
"The man you seek is talking to the dragon woman," said the dragon.
"I hope we're in time. Dive now! Go low!" ordered Two Flower.
"I think not," said Eleazar. Hurun took the wine cup slowly. He grinned like a pumpkin. Then something like a green blur flashed across the arena, and Hurun was gone. The wine cup hung momentarily in the air, then crashed down the steps. In the instant of enfolding Hurun gently in his claws, Ninereeds the dragon had momentarily synchronized their bodily rhythms. The effect of this was to instantly transform a stationary and priapic Hurun into a Hurun moving sideways at 80 miles an hour with no ill effects whatsoever. Another effect was to cause Eleazar to scream with rage and summon her dragon. She leapt astride it, still naked, and snatched a crossbow from one of the guards. Then she was airborne, while the other dragon riders swarmed towards their own beasts.
"You clowns!" screamed Hurun from his perch on Ninereed's foreclaws.
"What did he say?" roared Rincewind as the dragon ripped its way through the air in the race for the heights. "Didn't hear!" bellowed Two Flower, his voice torn away by the gale. As the dragon banked slightly, he looked down. Far, far below, the shore of the Circle Sea stretched like a silver ribbon. Craning his neck, he squinted at the Wurmberg and saw the swarm of creatures rising in pursuit. Ninereed's wings pounded and flicked the air away contemptuously. Thinner air, too. Two Flower's ear popped for the third time.
"I could have been a lord, and you clowns had to go and—"
Hurun gasped as the chill, thin air drew the life even out of his mighty chest.
"What's happening to the air?"
muttered Rincewind. Blue lights appeared in front of his eyes. said Two Flower, and passed out. The dragon vanished. For a few seconds, the three men continued upwards. Two Flower and the wizard presenting an odd picture as they sat one in front of the other with their legs astride something that wasn't there. Then what passed for gravity on the disc recovered from the surprise and claimed them. At that moment, Eleazar's dragon flashed by, and Hurun landed heavily across its neck. Eleazar leant over and kissed him. This detail was lost to Rincewind as he dropped away with his arms still clasped around Two Flower's waist. The whole world was coming up towards them like a giant custard pie. "Wake up!" he shouted. "Dragons! Think of dragons!" No answer came from Two Flower. "Dragons!" thought Rincewind in a panic. He tried to concentrate his mind, tried to envisage a really lifelike dragon. But nothing happened. Clutching the inert Two Flower around the waist, Rincewind plunged towards the disc sea several hundred feet below. The cold waters roared up at him and sucked him down into their green embrace. A moment later, there was another splash as the luggage also hit the water, which gives a further indication, if one were needed, of just how resourceful Sapient Pearwood is. Later on, They used it as a raft. Close to the edge. It had been a long time in the making. Now it was almost completed, and the slaves hacked away at the last clay remnants of the mantle. The arch-astronomer of Krul motioned lightly with his hand, and his bearers set the throne down in the shadow of the hull. Like a fish, he thought. A great flying fish. And of what seas? A fish that could swim through the seas of space that lie between the worlds. "Are the Chelonauts ready?" the arch-astronomer asked. The master launch controller bustled forward. "Indeed, Your Prominence," he said. "How long to the doorway?" "The launch window," corrected the master launch controller carefully. 3 days, Your Prominence. Great Atuin's tail will be in an unmatched position." "Then all that remains," concluded the arch-astronomer, "is to find the appropriate sacrifices." "If only you could navigate! If only you could steer!" A wave washed over the deck. Rincewind and Two-Flower looked at each other. "I don't see how it's my fault," Two-Flower said. "You were supposed to be on watch," snapped Rincewind. "I saved us from the slavers, remember?" said Two-Flower. "I'd rather be a slave than a corpse," replied the wizard. He looked out to sea. There was definitely less horizon than there ought to be. Said Rincewind. "I said we're bound to strike land sooner or later," said Two-Flower. "This current must go somewhere." "Look at the horizon," said Rincewind. Two-Flower squinted. "Looks all right. Admittedly, there seems to be less than there usually is, but that's because of the rim fall," said Rincewind. "We're being carried over the edge of the world." There was a long silence, broken only by the lapping of the waves as the boat spun slowly in the current. It was already quite strong. "Would you like something to eat?" asked Two-Flower. He began to rummage through the bundle that he had tied to the rail out of the damp. "Don't you understand? We're going over the edge, goddammit!" "I wish I had my picture box," said Two-Flower, "but it's back on that slaver ship with the rest of the luggage, and you won't need luggage where we're going," said Rincewind. He stared moodily at a whale that had carelessly strayed into the rimward current and was now struggling against it. There was a line of white on the foreshortened horizon, and the wizard fancied he could hear a distant roaring. "What happens after a ship goes over the rimfall?" asked Two-Flower. "Who knows?" "Well, in that case, perhaps we'll just sail on through space and land on another world." A faraway look came into the little man's eyes. "I'd like that." Rincewind snorted. The sea around them seemed to be getting crowded. Rincewind noticed several tree trunks keeping station with them, and just below the surface the water was alive with fish of all sorts. He wondered what kind of life it would be, having to keep swimming all the time to stay exactly in the same place. Pretty similar to his own, he decided. He spotted a small green frog which was paddling desperately. He found a paddle and carefully extended it towards the little amphibian, which scrambled onto it gratefully. A moment later, a pair of jaws broke the water and snapped impotently at the spot where it had been swimming. The frog looked up at Rincewind from the cradle of his hands and then bit him thoughtfully on the thumb. Two-Flower giggled. Rincewind tucked the frog away in a pocket and pretended he hadn't heard. The roaring was louder now. A squid, bigger than anything Rincewind had seen before, broke the surface a few hundred yards away and thrashed madly with its tentacles before sinking away. A whole squadron of flying fish tumbled up in a cloud of rainbow-edged droplets and managed to gain a few yards before dropping back and being swept in an eddy. They were running out of world. Rincewind snatched at the mast as the roaring final end of everything raced towards them. "I must see this," said Two-Flower, half falling and half diving towards the prow. Something hard and unyielding smacked into the hull. A wash of cold sea cascaded over the deck. Rincewind was under several feet of boiling green water. He began to scream, and then the world became the deep, clanging purple colour of fading consciousness. He awoke with his mouth full of burning liquid. Two-Flower was looking down at him with an expression of deep concern. Rincewind groaned and sat up. This turned out to be a mistake. The edge of the world was a few feet away. Beyond it, at a level just below that of the lip of the endless rimfall, was something altogether magical. Some 70 miles away, a dhow with the red sails typical of a freelance slaver drifted aimlessly through the velvety twilight. The crew were clustered on the foredeck. The captain, a thick-set man who wore the elbow turbans typical of a great Neff tribesman, had never before been really frightened. Now he was terrified. "I can't hear anything," he muttered. As if in answer, there came a furious pounding from the oar deck below their feet, and the sound of splintering wood. The crewmen drew together fearfully, brandishing axes and torches. They probably wouldn't dare to use them, even if the monster came rushing towards them. Before its terrible nature had been truly understood, several men had attacked it with axes, whereupon it had turned aside from its single-minded searching of the ship, and had either chased them overboard or had eaten them. The captain wasn't quite certain. The thing looked like an ordinary wooden sea chest, a bit larger than usual maybe, but not suspiciously so. It was just that the men who had been drowned overboard had probably been more fortunate than those it had caught. There had been teeth, teeth like white wooden gravestones, and a tongue red as mahogany. This was the last time he rescued drowning men in mysterious circumstances. Slavery was better than sharks, wasn't it? And then they'd escaped in the dinghy, and when his sailors had investigated their big chest, how had they appeared in the middle of an untroubled ocean sitting on a big chest anyway? And it had bit... "Rafts ready, Lord," said the first mate. "Into the water with it," shouted the captain, "and get aboard, and fire the ship!" "What the hell is that?" demanded Rincewind. "It is the Rimbo," said a voice immediately behind his left ear. The voice was accompanied by a gust of cold, fishy breath. "Two-Flower," he said. "Yes?" "If I turn around, what will I see?" "His name is Tethys. He says he's a sea troll. This is his boat. He rescued us," explained Two-Flower. "Will you look round now?" "Not just at the moment, thank you. So, why aren't we going over the edge then?" asked Rincewind with glassy calmness. "Because your boat hits the circumfence," said the voice behind him. "The circumfence?" "Yes, it runs along the edge of the world." "Ah, you mean the circumference," said Rincewind. "The circumference makes the edge of things." "So does the circumfence," said the troll. "He means this," said Two-Flower, pointing. Hubwards of the boat was a rope suspended a few feet above the surface of the white water. The boat was attached to it, moored yet mobile, by a complicated arrangement of pulleys and wheels. They ran along the rope as the unseen rower propelled the craft along the very lip of the rimfall. That explained one mystery, but what supported the rope? Rincewind peered along its length and saw a stout wooden post sticking up out of the water a few yards ahead. As he watched, the boat neared it and then passed it, the little wheels clacking neatly around it in a groove obviously cut for the purpose. Rincewind also noticed that smaller ropes hung down from the main rope at intervals of a yard or so. Behind him, the sea troll said, "Up ahead is my house. We will talk more when we are there. Now I must row." Rincewind looked at the Rimbo, which hung in the mists beyond the edge of the world, appearing only at morning and evening, when the light of the disk's little orbiting sun shone past the massive bulk of Great Artuin, the world turtle, and struck the disk's magical field at exactly the right angle. A double rainbow coruscated into being. Close into the lip of the rimfall were the 7 lesser colours, sparkling and dancing in the spray of the dying seas. But they were pale in comparison to the wider band that floated beyond them, not deigning to share the same spectrum. It was the king colour, of which all the lesser colours are merely partial and wishy-washy reflections. It was octarine, the colour of magic. It was alive and glowing and vibrant, and it was the undisputed pigment of the imagination.
Who made this
Because
road?
wherever it appeared, it was a sign that mere matter was a servant of the powers of the magical mind. It was enchantment itself. Rincewind always thought it looked a sort of greenish purple. After a while, a small speck on the rim of the world resolved itself into an eot or crag, so perilously perched that the waters of the fall swirled around it at the start of their long drop. A driftwood shanty had been built on it, and Rincewind saw that the top rope of the circumfence climbed over the rocky island on a number of iron stakes and actually passed through the shack by a small round window. A floating stockade had been built out of rough timber on the hubward side of the island. It contained 1 or 2 hulks and quite a large amount of floating wood in the form of planks, balks, and even whole tree trunks. The boat slid up against a small jetty. The wizard and Two-Flower scrambled onto the planking, and for the first time, Rincewind saw the troll. Instead of the betentacled monstrosity he'd been expecting, he found himself looking at a rather squat but not particularly ugly old man, apparently composed of water and very little else. The troll was a pleasant, translucent blue colour. As Rincewind stared, a small shoal of silvery fish flashed across his chest. Two-Flower and Rincewind followed him into the hut. The troll lit a couple of lamps and poured 2 cups of green liquid from a tall pitcher. In the dim light, he appeared to phosphoresce in the manner of warm seas on velvety summer nights. Rincewind reached for a cup and looked at the green pool shimmering inside it. He drank. His mouth twisted. He whimpered a little. One of his legs came up convulsively and caught him painfully in the chest. Two-Flower swirled his own drink thoughtfully while he considered the flavour. Glenlivet, he said. A certain smoky quality, piquant, from the western plantations in Ragreed province, yes? May I ask how you came by it? All things drift into the circumfence in time. My job is to recover the flotsam, timber, of course, and ships, barrels of wine, bales of cloth. You. Light dawned inside Rincewind's head. It's a net, isn't it? You've got a net right on the edge of the sea. The circumfence, nodded the troll. Ripples ran across his chest. The net would have to be very strong, Rincewind said. It is. It could be extended for a couple of miles if you found enough rocks and things, said the wizard. 10,000 of miles. I just patrol this league. That's a third of the way around the disk. Tethys told them about the ancient and wise kingdom of Kurul, which had constructed the circumfence several centuries before, and about the 7 navies that patrolled it constantly to keep it in repair and bring its salvage back to Kurul, and about the way in which sailors marooned on the circumfence were turned into slaves and usually had their tongues cut out. I won't be a slave, said Rincewind. I'd jump over the edge first. Would you, though? Asked the troll. One blue arm caught the wizard around the waist. A moment later, the troll was striding out of the shack with Rincewind gripped carelessly in one fist. He didn't stop until he came to the rimward edge of the island. Rincewind squealed. Look, commanded the troll. Rincewind looked. In front of him was a soft black night whose mist-muted stars glowed peacefully, but his eyes turned downwards, drawn by some irresistible fascination. On either side, 2 glittering curtains of water hurtled towards infinity as the sea swept around the island on its way to the long fall, bathed in the golden underworld light. Huge shadows grew out of that light, like pillars supporting the roof of the universe. Hundreds of miles below him, the wizard made out the shape of something. The edge of something. The head of an elephant as big as a reasonably sized continent. Below the elephant, Rincewind swallowed and tried not to think. Below the elephant, there was the distant, painful disk of the sun, and sweeping slowly past it was something that, for all its city-sized scales, its crater pox, its lunar cragginess, was indubitably a flipper. "Shall I let go?" suggested the troll. "Nah," said Rincewind. Tethys stepped back and allowed Rincewind to fling himself onto the ground. Two-Flower strolled up to the rim and peered over. "Fantastic," he said. "If only I had my picture box. What else is down there?" A bell jangled in the darkness. They returned to the hut. Tethys strode across the creaking floor to the complicated devices of levers, strings and bells that was mounted on the circumfence's topmost strand, where it passed through the hut. The bell rang again, and then started to clang away in an odd, jerky rhythm for several minutes. The troll stood with his ear pressed close to it. When it stopped, he turned slowly and looked at them with a worried frown. "You're more important than I thought," he said. "You're not to wait for the salvage fleet. You're to be collected by a flyer." He shrugged. "And I hadn't even sent a message that you're here yet. I wonder how—" He picked up a large mallet that hung on a pillar beside the bell and used it to tap out a brief carillon. "That'll be passed from lengthman to lengthman all the way back to Karul," he said. "Marvellous, really, isn't it?" The lens skimming towards the island was perhaps 20 feet across and totally transparent. Sitting around its circumference were a large number of black-robed men, each one strapped securely to the disc.
I have to go to bed now, so we'll play more tomorrow with the audiobook in the background. Yeah, good night.